In this current decade of the 2020s, more than ever before, we are being bombarded with more news daily than we could ever hope to meaningfully process. Every day, news and videos of atrocities from around the world can be viewed by people on the other side of the world a mere minute after they happened. While this has undoubtedly helped expose us to more news that we wouldn't have had access to, connected us and personalized struggles happening across the globe, journalism and the reporting being done by mainstream media has more and more suffered in quality and in-depth analysis in an attempt to keep up with the constant, non-stop flow of information. The late American philosopher Friedrich Jameson sums up this development in his book The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. I believe that the emergence of postmodernism is closely related to the emergence of this new moment of late consumer or multinational capitalism. I believe also that its formal features in many ways express the deeper logic of that particular social system. I will only be able, however, to show this for one major theme, namely the disappearance of a sense of history, the way in which our entire contemporary social system has little by little begun to lose its capacity to retain its own past, has begun to live in a perpetual present and in a perpetual change that obliterates traditions of the kind which all earlier social formations have had in one way or another to preserve. More and more, news stories are being reported on and analyzed as separate, immediate, disconnected events, which of course leads the readers of this news to begin to think of their current country, their current situation, in the same way, in this perpetual present, with no attention or care placed on how history relates to these events, that the future outcome will be due to the actions we take today, and how the events that are constantly being reported on are not random individual incidents, but rather the next step in a long chain of developments that we all interact with. If you watch my videos, YouTube tells me that statistically you were probably born in between the late 80s and the early 2000s. So I know it for a fact that statistically, anytime the media in your lifetime has reported on news involving the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly just referred to as North Korea, it was probably one of two things: an update on developments in the military or nuclear systems of the DPRK, or a news story about the living conditions for North Koreans, highlighting the poverty and restrictions on their daily life. All of these individual stories, framed through the American and European media, reinforce the idea of North Korea that we have built in our heads over the years. And for most of us, North Korea also exists in this perpetual present, as if the government or the people of North Korea just decided one day that they were going to be a totalitarian dictatorship because they wanted to be one, and every news headline we've read over the years are just reinforcements of this idea. Nobody learns anything about North Korea. We all just collectively know about it. That North Korea isn't something that is developing due to internal and external forces, it has just always been. In this short video, I want to challenge you and what you know about North and South Korea, and how you know what you know. I want to talk about the development and current state of these two countries, but also analyze our media and our education system, what it focuses on and what it ignores, and how that can subconsciously shape our view of the world to keep us locked into this perpetual present. Because the Koreas, like any other country in the world, are not living in a perpetual present. They are rather, more so than most countries I would argue, anchored to their past. And without properly engaging with that past, we cannot even hope to understand the present. And through this engagement, hopefully we can come to a clearer answer to a obvious question that is still almost never posed or interrogated in a meaningful way. Why are there two Koreas, and why have they not unified? In the United States, the Korean War is often dubbed as the Forgotten War. The Korean War happened in between the Second World War and the Vietnam War, two much more famous wars that had more effect on the US itself, hence the lack of education in schools and how it became forgotten. I myself, who did all of my primary schooling in the US, never once had a class that touched on this war in a meaningful way, and the first time I even learned about it happening was because we had a Veterans Day celebration and some classmates' grandfathers said that they fought in Korea. But the Korean War is only mostly forgotten in the United States. The outcome of the war is integral to the present of both North and South Korea, and is certainly not forgotten by the families of the almost 3 million Koreans who died in the war, or the millions of families who were separated or fled Korea during it. But like almost every war, the Korean War was the result of the war that was fought before it, World War II. During the Second World War, and for decades before that, Korea had been under Japanese occupation. By the late 1910s, the Japanese occupation had increasingly replaced Korean culture, like the language and education systems, with their own, and replaced Korean capital and administrators with Japanese ones. Koreans strongly resisted this subjugation of their society, and on March 1st, 1919, after a group of Koreans had created a petition for independence from Japan, thousands of protests broke out across the peninsula that was supported by nearly 2 million Koreans, among them Kim Hyung-sik, a herbalist and independence activist whose son will later become a very important part of this story. Despite the overwhelmingly peaceful nature of the protests, they were met with violent suppression from the Japanese forces, with Korean records counting more than 7,000 deaths taking place at the protests, many of which were the result of intentional massacres, including one instance where soldiers locked Korean protesters in a church and burned it to the ground. Despite the repression, the Korean population did not stand down, and eventually Japan would have to concede by reforming its colonial policy. Bunka Seiji, the new cultural policy of the occupation, would relax restrictions on the Korean language, on the freedom to assemble, and on the distribution of local newspapers. With these newly granted freedoms, the Korean resistance movement was able to continue developing and began to take two distinctly different forms: nationalism and socialism. The reason I'm bringing this up now is because as the story continues, and especially during the Korean War, the United States and other actors will repeatedly claim that the presence of socialist ideology in Korea, that communist parties and resistance to a specifically nationalist form of government were all imported into Korea by force by the Soviet Union. But the Korean independence movement quite naturally began to sympathize more and more with the socialist revolutionaries over the nationalist ones for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons being that Japan's occupation of Korea took the form of colonial extraction, which forced Koreans to work very long hours in brutal working conditions, just so that the coal and the agriculture they produced would be sent back to Japan. One of the early forms of resistance in this post-1919 era of occupied Korea was the establishment of workers' cooperatives to relieve some of the stress placed on Koreans at this time. Throughout the 20s, Koreans established hundreds of cooperatives in neighborhoods and in workplaces with the intent of overcoming the economic problems that they suffered due to the occupation. People would put money aside to this cooperative to collectively buy products needed for daily life in bulk to get them for cheaper. Any surplus they made that they could hide from colonial officials would also be put together to sell and raise more money for the cooperatives, and money that was saved by these organizations could then be reinvested into the community, like funding schools or buying medical equipment or donated to people who had suffered from natural disasters. An example of one of these cooperatives is the Hamchang Cooperative, which started with only 11 farmers in the 1920s, but quickly grew to over 400, who collectively pooled all of their crops together to be able to have more influence on the price in the markets than they would have if each of them had been selling as individuals. The Japanese colonial officials recognized these cooperatives as a threat to their system in the early 30s, and they were banned and suppressed until they had to eventually disappear. This was not Koreans practicing socialism, but it's very clear that worker solidarity and communalizing both what they wanted to sell and the little leftover money they had are values and forms of resistance that would make Koreans more sympathetic towards socialist rather than purely nationalist ideals who were advocating for the overthrow of a Japanese landlord and business owning class to then replace these positions with a Korean landlord and business owning class. On top of this, well-known nationalist activists who had taken part in the March 1st demonstrations, such as Eunsoo Choi, had turned into Japanese collaborators as the years went on, a trend that we will continue to analyze following the Korean War. Koreans had also begun to be influenced by the political developments in their neighboring countries, the USSR and China. Koreans had been fleeing to eastern Russia since before the Russian Revolution, and as the country had its revolution and Korean laborers began to see material changes in their life, Koreans traveling to and from Russia began to hear and see what socialism had to offer, and so the ideology quite naturally grew within the Korean independence movement. Quoting the South Korean political scientist Soo Dae-suk, to the older Koreans who had groveled so long before seemingly endless foreign suppression, communism seemed a new hope and a magic touch. For Koreans in general, the sacrifices of the communists, if not the idea of communism, made strong appeal, far stronger than any occasional bomb-throwing exercise of the nationalists. The haggard appearance of the communists suffering from torture, their stern and disciplined attitude toward the common enemy of all Koreans had a far-reaching effect on the people. So, through a combination of natural community-based resistance towards the Japanese imperialist economic structure, the proximity to the USSR, and the first-hand accounts of their family and neighbors who had lived through a socialist revolution, and the tendency of nationalists to become collaborators with Japan, the Korean independence movement increasingly became interested in not just an independent Korean state, but a socialist Korean state. In the Second World War, Japan had implemented a military draft that affected millions of Korean men and women. As the war continued, Japan would need more and more workers to fulfill its needs, and millions of Korean men would be forced to work in mines and in construction to fulfill the needs of the empire. By the end of the war, 1/3 of the industrial labor force in Japan was Korean. These workers would be paid next to nothing, work brutally long hours with little to no access to proper food or water, and be constantly moved around inside of Japan and its colonies. Both cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destinations where thousands of Koreans conscripted to labor were forced to work in industry building up the Japanese military, and thousands of Koreans were killed in the dropping of the atom bombs by the US. Of course, though, it wasn't just men who were affected by conscription, but hundreds of thousands of Korean women and girls who would be forced into the position of comfort women, a euphemism for sexual slavery, and sent around the Japanese Empire to work at rape stations for soldiers in the army, a practice that would continue for years after the fall of the empire. Throughout the Second World War, Koreans who had fled to China or been moved there by force by the Japanese began to organize themselves into armed resistance groups against Japanese imperialism, hoping to bring the fight back to their home in Korea. One of these fighters was a young Korean communist in his early 20s, Kim Il-sung. Many Koreans who had been living in China for years by the time the Second World War broke out had become deeply involved in the communist resistance growing in China. So many, in fact, that in the northeastern part of China, Manchuria, the part that borders both Korea and Russia, 8 out of every 10 anti-Japanese guerrilla fighters were Korean, and the majority of the members of the Communist Party of China active in this region were also Korean. Although Kim Il-sung was born in a little village near Pyongyang, he had moved to Manchuria in his early teens, and by his 20s was a member of the CPC and had been an active guerrilla fighter involved in the resistance to Japanese imperialism. He was so significant, in fact, that the Japanese army created a special division of soldiers specifically to find and kill him. By the end of the war, not only had Kim managed to be a soldier in various resistance groups, including a battalion of the Soviet Red Army, but he had grown extremely popular in Korea itself, and had become one of the most popular figures in the Korean independence movement. After the Japanese surrendered in 1945, a condition of which was renouncing its claim over its overseas colonies, the Korean peninsula needed to establish, for the first time in nearly 4 decades, a Korean state. But what would that state look like? By the time of the surrender, Soviet troops had already entered Korea and had been fighting with Japanese soldiers in the north. It wouldn't be for another month that American troops would arrive in the south. For a brief while, Korea remained functionally without a government, and it was up to recently liberated Koreans to organize and meet the immediate needs of their communities. The way that this was done across the peninsula was overwhelmingly through self-organized people's committees that were usually organizations of towns and cities who would elect local leaders, organize food distribution, create systems for basic healthcare and childcare, remove Japanese collaborators from positions of power and try them for their crimes, and pass land reform that redistributed the property of landlords. These people's committees were not all connected to one another, largely operated primarily on a local basis, and were also not all politically aligned with one another, as the people who would be elected to lead these committees ranged from communists to nationalists and conservatives. These committees would not last in this form for very long, but this brief period where Korea was basically without a government shows us a glimpse of how the country might have developed naturally before the founding of two separate states. Before the war had even ended, the USSR and the USA had agreed that Korea would be removed from Japan's influence and agreed to execute a trusteeship for 5 years where Korea would be occupied along the 38th parallel, with the USSR in the north and the US in the south. Originally, the goal of the trusteeship was for eventually a unified Korea to emerge after the end of the 5 year period, but as we will see, this hope quickly dissolved in the face of the coming political developments. From here on out, I'll need to talk about the way that both the North and the South developed separately because both the US and the USSR had very different ways they influenced the development of the states we know today. So I will start with the South. Similarly to what had happened in Germany with Nazis fleeing out of the Soviet-occupied territories into American-occupied territories that would become West Germany, Japanese soldiers and officials stationed in northern Korea, as well as many collaborators, also fled into the American occupation zone, sabotaging mines and factories in the north while retreating. As with Germany, the primary goal of the US was not really to denazify the government, but to make the new government an ally in the Cold War. I made a whole video on Germany's failed denazification, which you can watch here, but a similar process was carried out in Japan, where important figures in the Imperial Japanese military, from Emperor Hirohito and the leader of the infamous Unit 731, Shido Ishii, were pardoned for their involvement in war crimes. Many members of the Japanese imperial government that had supported the war would be reincorporated into the new Japanese state, and the same was true for the slowly developing state in South Korea. Quoting Richard E. Robinson, chief of the public opinion section of the Department of Information of the military government in the South, about the American arrival to the South, no sooner had the group arrived than it took over a suite of rooms in the Chosun Hotel in Seoul, the largest and plushiest hotel in Korea, and threw a big party for ranking Japanese military and government officials. Koreans who approached the Americans to discuss their plight were summarily shown the door with a minimum of courtesy. The affair turned into a glorious drunken brawl with the Japanese, which lasted for several days. Once the party was over, the Americans began to look at how the Koreans had actually organized themselves. Self-organized, town-by-town based communes that were occasionally run by communists or other left-wing sympathizers did not lend itself very well to the capitalist-oriented anti-Soviet Korea the US had had in mind, especially now that the Cold War was in effect, so the restructuring of the entire system in South Korea was needed. In favor of this goal, the US established a military government in the South that recreated the Japanese colonial structure and even used many of the same collaborators and administrators in this new government, although mass protests did eventually force them to appoint more Korean independence activists. Nevertheless, the military government still had to carry out its objectives of reconstructing Korea similar to the administrative Japanese system, but in the face of the resistance that Koreans had put up, they needed to set up a strong police force that would help them carry this out. Under the Japanese, 23,000 police officers were needed to enforce the occupation, 40% of which had been Korean collaborators. Of these collaborators and colonial officials, many of whom had been removed from their positions of power by the People's Communes, 85% had been reinstated as police officers in the military government, including Japanese people that had worked for the empire. In addition to this, collaborators fleeing the north were also quite frequently hired to enforce the military government and its rules. After the military government's police force had been established, the total number of police in just the south of Korea surpassed the number of the police the Japanese had used to enforce colonial law in the entire peninsula. In order to get a Korea that was acceptable to Americans, they demanded complete submission to the military government and its laws, and resistance to the presence of the military government or the restructuring of Korea's system needed to be suppressed violently. The character of this new system could be clearly seen by the proclamations to the Korean people issued by General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, the first of which outlaws the self-governed communes and states, quoting, "All powers of government over the territory of Korea south of 38 degrees north latitude and the people thereof will be for the present exercised under my authority. All persons will promptly obey all my orders and orders issued under my authority. Acts of resistance to the occupying forces or any acts which may disturb public peace and safety will be punished severely." And the second of these proclamations threatens the death penalty for anybody who disobeyed or resisted. Subsequent proclamations passed by the military government included laws that prohibited the meeting of 3 or more people without prior registration to the government, the requirement of newspapers to receive licenses from the military, as well as the outright banning of any anti-occupation discussions. During the brief period where Korea had no government, Koreans had benefited from the land reforms carried out by the People's Communes, something that the United States now had to reverse by force. This reversal of land reforms was frequently met with resistance. Quoting Richard D. Robinson again, "There was the case of Namwon, a small community in North Cholla province. The Japanese had turned over considerable property to the local People's Committee just prior to the arrival of the Americans. The military government demanded the property, but the People's Committee refused to renounce the title, whereupon 5 leaders of the committee were arrested by the local Korean police. Shortly thereafter, the police chief was captured and beaten by committee members and the police station attacked by a large crowd of irate citizens. The station was guarded by American troops. When the Koreans refused to disband, the Americans advanced with fixed bayonets. 2 Koreans were killed and several injured. This incident was typical of many such cases." This repression of the system the American military was building was not without reason. Originally, the goal was for both Koreas to unite, but as time passed, political developments in both halves made this harder and harder. Both the US and the USSR had very different approaches to how the North and the South would be governed, with the US being less concerned with creating an independent Korea, but rather with the creation of a fiercely anti-communist state and a new ally in the Cold War, which is why the dismantling of self-organized people's communes that frequently passed land reforms and were at times governed by communists, and the banning of political organizations and newspapers unless first approved by the military was among the first things the Americans did. And it was not without reason. Not only were communist guerrilla fighters and local leaders popular in Korea, but the Korean masses despised most of the landlords and business owners who had, by and large, collaborated with the Japanese occupation. Shortly after the American arrival in Korea, Edwin Pauley, an advisor to President Harry Truman, told him, "Communism in Korea could get off to a better start than practically anywhere in the world." Even though the domino theory would officially be developed almost 10 years later by Dwight D. Eisenhower, American policy in Korea was already reflective of the position that they would do everything to prevent the establishment of a communist Korea. As early as September 1947, so years before the planned trusteeship was agreed to end, the Soviet representative in Korea, Terentij Shaitkov, proposed that both the Soviet and American military withdraw from Korea entirely, a proposal that was rejected by the Americans, fearing that if Koreans had an election, a communist would be likely to win. Months earlier, in January of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall would write Undersecretary Dean Acheson, "Please have a plan drafted of policy to organize a definite government of Korea and connect its economy with that of Japan." The plan was meant to solidify a pro-American state and officially start the process of permanently severing the two halves of Korea. In 1946, a U.S.-Soviet Joint Commission was established to discuss how reunification would take place, but after a few meetings and suggestions from both sides on how this should proceed, became increasingly clear that anything less than the establishment of an explicitly anti-communist state would be unacceptable to Americans. Quoting historian Mark Scher, the American-appointed Chief Justice of the Korean Supreme Court publicly declared that those who supported the trusteeship should either die or be sent to Russia. One official later wrote about this and said, "Of course, the real explanation of the American stand lay in the fact that the primary mission of the occupation of South Korea was not so much to establish a Korean democracy as to establish a bulwark against the expanding influence of Soviet ideology." General Hodge privately admitted as much on several occasions. No longer willing to work together, the U.S. went instead to the newly formed UN, an organization that was and remains an organization that is overwhelmingly influenced by the United States and its political allies, to declare separate elections in the south of Korea. The Soviet Union, the North Koreans, and many Koreans in the South were opposed to the involvement of the UN and thus opposed these elections. But with no political influence in an organization so clearly biased against them, the UN approved a plan which would allow elections to occur only in South Korea, but that the government formed from that election would then govern the entire peninsula. The illegitimacy of these elections would be even more apparent when it was revealed who had won them. The US had long had a problem with finding people to be a part of their military government, and who should be supported to become the leader of Korea. Unfortunately for them, the most popular options were people who had resisted the Japanese occupation, who were typically too left-wing for the Americans, but the most ideologically aligned with the Americans were usually Japanese collaborators, which would be completely rejected by Korean people. Thankfully, however, they found their solution in Syngman Rhee, who had flown into Korea on General MacArthur's private plane after the end of the Second World War. Syngman Rhee was a Korean independence activist who had left Korea more than 40 years ago. He had studied at Harvard University and had cultivated close friendships with numerous political and business elites in the US, and thankfully for the American government, was a hardlined anti-communist and enthusiastically encouraged the violent repression of any left-wing political activism. During the American occupation, political speech was heavily censored by the military, except for Rhee. While a few political figures, mostly right-wingers and moderates, were given a 15-minute window monthly to discuss their political ideas for the future of Korea, Syngman Rhee was given a weekly radio show where he could openly talk about his political beliefs and attack the Soviet Union. In addition, Rhee's friendship with men in the US government who were planning on establishing a Korean-American trading company designed to monopolize Korean foreign trade, and his friendships with people who were heavily involved in American media, which allowed him to attack members of the US military and government who did not favor him as president of Korea, gave him a clear advantage over any other possible candidate running. And to give you an idea of just how disconnected the military government, the Korean National Police, and the UN were from the idea of Korean independence, just a few short weeks before the elections would take place in the South, a parade of rehabilitated Korean collaborators in the Japanese army marched throughout Seoul, led by Kim Sok-woon, who changed his name to the more Japanese Kaneyama Shakugan, a decorated colonel in the Imperial Army that was personally involved in the hunt for Kim Il-sung back in Manchuria. In July 1948, thanks in part to the tens of thousands of leftists that had been imprisoned by the military and not allowed to vote, the boycotting of the few Korean political parties that widely recognized this to be an illegitimate election, and Korean citizens of the South being dragged by force to voting booths under threat of losing their ration cards, Syngman Rhee won his elections in the South, and the Republic of Korea was officially established. As a response to this, the military government had handed over control of the South to Syngman Rhee, but the US military would not, and have not to this day, ever left South Korea. In 1949, a now declassified CIA report outlines the reason for this, that widespread discontent with the division of their country and the formation of an unpopular government would cause revolts that would lead to the dissolution of the Republic of Korea that the North would use to unify the peninsula again. Syngman Rhee was very well aware that this was a real possibility and welcomed a continued American occupation of the South, who had by now become very much entangled in the formation of the Korean Army and Korean National Police. In South Korea itself, the elections were also not accepted as legitimate by everyone and were compared to a continuation of an occupation. But with the vast Korean National Police that had been built up by the military government at his disposal, he was able to take the repression of political dissent to another level. For example, in the 3 years of military government, 22,000 Koreans had been imprisoned. In just the first year of Rhee's government, almost 90,000 more people would be arrested, the vast majority of which were for some form of anti-government activism or labor organizing. And when arresting wasn't enough to repress dissent, the newly formed South Korean government frequently turned to simply killing them. Violence against leftists and people who rejected the government was not only carried out by the police and the military, but by organized gangs that had been founded and supported by the US military government. One prominent example would be the Korean National Youth Association, a far-right nationalist youth gang that received millions of US dollars in funding, but also weapons from the US military that members would use to intimidate or attack anti-government protesters. The founder of this gang, Lee Byung-seok, identified his movement with fascism and motivated members of his gang to study the program of the Hitler Youth. When Syngman Rhee came to power, Lee Byung-seok was made the first prime minister of South Korea, something that only emboldened the already violent far-right youth gangs. However, the most famous case of Syngman Rhee's government's brutality before the Korean War is undoubtedly his response to the protests on Jeju Island. Jeju is an island to the south of the Korean peninsula, and the Jeju people are an ethnic subgroup of Koreans with their own separate culture, language, and traditions. Following the end of the Second World War, Jejuans also had organized themselves into people's communes, and just like the mainland, had also strongly resisted the imposition of a separate Korean state that they did not want. Due to Jeju being an island and a bit harder to control than the mainland, the Workers' Party of Korea, a communist party that was outlawed in the south but still operated secretly, had a strong support base among Jejuans. And by 1947, with it becoming clearer and clearer that the military government had no intention of reunifying Korea, the WPK launched a guerrilla resistance movement against the government. As people on the island protested the government, the police would show up, accuse them of being communist guerrillas, kill a bunch of random civilians, and then in response, WPK guerrilla fighters would then go out and kill a bunch of police officers. In 1948, when it was announced that South Korea would hold separate elections, the island exploded in protests opposing their legitimacy, and every time the police would come to kill protesters, more would come out against them. 4 months after the formation of Rhee's government, he proclaimed martial law on the island, and the police and military moved in to put down the growing resistance movement. As a result, by 1949, roughly 30,000 people had been killed, although modern historians estimate the real number is actually much higher, with a vast majority of them having been civilians and not resistance fighters. 70% of all the villages on the island were destroyed in the massacres, and more than 20,000 people were arrested. To put that into perspective, Jeju Island had a population of around 300,000 people, meaning that at least 1 in every 10 Jejuans was eradicated. And I use that term because that's the term that the South Korean government used. They referred to Jeju as an eradication campaign. It should be noted that although at this point Rhee was the head of the government, the United States was completely supportive of his policies, provided military assistance to South Korea while carrying out the massacre, and laid the groundwork for this and continued political repression in the South. This was said quite explicitly by General John Hodge, the governor of the American military government, when he compared the militarization of the South Korean government to fight communism in the North by saying, "Germany was built up by Hitler to fight communism." Is it any surprise then that a country whose architect compared it to Nazi Germany would then carry out a massacre which has been described as a genocide by contemporary historians in less than the first 2 years of its existence? Now that we've made our way to the 1950s, we need to go back to 1945 and retell the story from the perspective of the North. Because North Korea and Kim Il-sung had a very different experience of this period than the South did. The very first provisional government set up in North Korea was the Provisional People's Committee of North Korea, and to describe Soviet involvement in the creation of this government, I'll use the National Institute of Korean History, which is directly connected to and financed by the South Korean government, as a source here, so that if anyone in my comments blames me for not immediately calling North Korea a Soviet puppet state, you can take your complaints to the South Koreans. As in the South, various people's committees were formed in the North that typically worked independently of one another. When the Soviet civil administration in North Korea began, all of these committees were integrated into it, and Soviet policies to help structure the Korean economy were implemented. Policies that included things like land reforms, which were incredibly popular and were already being done. Quoting the National Institute of Korean History, the civil administration played a practical role in implementing these policies. Unlike the US military government in South Korea, this Soviet civil administration did not claim to be a central government or implement comprehensive policies comparable to those of the central government. Most specific policies were directly implemented by provincial people's committees, and the Soviet civil administration merely dictated core guidelines. 10 bureaus were formed to administer different aspects of North Korean life, from transportation to health to agriculture and finance, that were led by Korean people elected to the position. And unlike in the American sector, where everything was governed top-down by the central government, had most of the administrative work done across North Korea done by Koreans in each of their respective people's committees. In 1946, the first elections for the official forming of the Provisional People's Committee of North Korea were held, officially establishing the government and electing Kim Il-sung as chairman. Although Kim Il-sung was a communist that saw the USSR as a close ally, not everyone in the first government was a communist, and there were many independents, social democrats, or various religious groups that held important positions in the North Korean government. The Soviet Union was certainly involved in the creation of North Korea and its government structures, from passing down core guidelines that needed to be followed and editing the very first North Korean constitution. But this involvement was very different from the US involvement in South Korea. The self organized people committees were not restructured and were maintained throughout this period. Koreans took care of all aspects of civil administration themselves and was not a country only run by communists, although the communists were hugely influential and soon became the dominant political party, but ran in a Democratic Front United ticket that was a coalition between the Workers' Party of Korea, the Korean Social Democratic Party, and the Cheongdoist Cheongwoo Party, which is a religious nationalist party which follows the Korean religion Cheondism. Now that we've talked a bit about how North Korea was set up and operated, I'd like to talk about how life was actually like for North Koreans in the 5 years leading up to the Korean War. And I'll introduce one of my sources for this part here as well because I would actually recommend everybody reads it. Anna Louise Strong was an American journalist who was active in the early American labor movement and then traveled the world to document incredibly important world events like life in the Soviet Union in the 30s, the formation of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Spanish Civil War. She traveled all around China to document the effects of the revolution, most famously in Tibet. She interviewed Mao, and she was one of the only American journalists who even bothered to go to North Korea to see what life was like there. Her book about it is pretty short, available for free online, and I'd highly recommend you check out her work. Quoting Strong from her journey to North Korea, "The whole of Korea is thus what is called an Iron Curtain country. But who, one wonders, put that curtain up? After I applied for a visa to North Korea and got it, I learned that the big American agencies did not want the news. They told me flatly that they preferred to get the tales of the Soviet zone from the refugees who ran away from it, which is about like getting one's facts about London from Berlin during the war. They assured me that I myself would get no real facts in the Soviet zone, but would be watched and handicapped at every turn." Since the beginning of the North Korean government, the US and its allies painted the picture of a country that was under complete totalitarian control of a communist party. But certainly before the Korean War, this was untrue. Each political party in the government had its own newspapers, in addition to many privately owned newspapers, and when it came to radio, every Korean village had access to a wide range of channels, including those that came from Japan and from the American occupied South. As for the agricultural policies and expropriations that the Americans accused of being a Sovietization of Korea, the policies ended up having a really positive effect on daily life. Japan had largely separated agricultural and industrial production on the Korean peninsula during occupation, with agriculture largely remaining in the south. With access to these lands cut off and the lack of promised deliveries from South Korea, hunger was becoming a real threat. But by 1947, with the collectivization of land from landlords and farmers' banks providing cheap loans for seeds, fertilizer, and tools, not only did the living conditions of farmers increase, but cultivated land increased by 17% in 2 years, and by 1948, North Korea could feed itself with food grown in only North Korea, something that was never possible while under Japanese rule. Food was then rationed out to make sure that everyone had enough and could afford what they needed to meet their needs. Strong talks to Lee Mei-hwa, a gold miner, about food rationing. "Now I get rationed food, 750 grams of rice a day for my ration and the same amount for my husband. We are both first category workers. This rationed rice costs only 5 yen a kilo, so the basic rice food costs only 230 yen a month from the family wage of 6,000 yen. A series of progressive laws would be passed in the first few years of the government. Child labor, which was widespread during the Japanese occupation and in South Korea, was outlawed. Women were promised an equal wage to men for the same work, and an 8-hour work week was established. Additional light industry, like the manufacturing of shoes and textiles, was also developed in the North to continue on its path of self reliance. A campaign to eradicate illiteracy was launched and education facilities were set up for adults who had never received proper education. Mass unemployment in the South caused many Koreans to move into the North to find jobs in industry and agriculture, which they received. Quoting Strong again, "What is the biggest change in your lives made by liberation?" I asked a group of workers in the Kensico Works. They discussed it among themselves and combined these three answers. First, formerly we worked 13 hours a day and had no time to think. Now we work 8 hours and we know all kinds of things about the world. Second, formerly we ate no rice but only husks of soya beans. Now we have a good rice ration of 1.5 pounds daily and we live in better houses too. Third, formerly we had no voice in anything. Now we have a voice in management through our trade union and a voice in government through our votes. The government forming in the North, for all of its faults and the involvement of the Soviet Union, was one where workers had actually felt represented, where government programs were set up to take care of the people and where the poor, unemployed, and persecuted of South Korea fled into. And speaking of persecution, how involved and present was the Soviet military in North Korea during this time? We already talked about how communists formed a front with non-communists to govern the provincial government together, but were there any massacres or oppression of non-communist Koreans in the Soviet zone? Strong maintains that throughout her travels, the only presence of Russians in the country at all was in the capital Pyongyang. One interviewed North Korean stated, "In all the running of the country, in elections, in police, in courts, in acts of government, we Koreans are the boss." In fact, one of the only times Strong recalls seeing Russian soldiers was at an anniversary festival celebrating the liberation of Korea. Quote, "In the banquet that followed, Russians and Koreans mingled on equal terms, drank alternate toasts, sang in turn the folk songs of their people. I was struck by the fact that the Russians responded with old Ukrainian love songs rather than with Bolshevik propaganda, and danced with each other's womenfolk. It was a natural, joyous celebration of a joint victory, but it was hard for me to imagine an American occupying army mingling in such easy equality with an Asiatic race." Another core pillar of the government forming in North Korea was the unification of the peninsula. For Kim Il-sung and for many of the nationalists active in the South, this was the primary goal, creating an independent, unified Korea. We already discussed the 1947 proposal by the Soviets to withdraw both armies simultaneously that was rejected by the Americans for the fear of communists possibly winning these elections. But there was another attempt led by both South and North Koreans for unity. In 1948, the elections in South Korea were announced to create a separate state and solidify the separation of the two Koreas. In response to this, the North Koreans wanted to also hold elections to create a national assembly that would represent both Koreas. In April of that year, a national unity conference was announced that invited people from both South and North Korea to convene and discuss the creation of an independent Korean government. When the elections in the South were announced, Koreans overwhelmingly rejected its legitimacy, including many nationalists and other anti-communists. 240 delegates representing over 50 different South Korean political organizations traveled to the north and took part in this Congress. After the discussion had been had, the conference declared itself in opposition to the legitimacy of the elections in South Korea, demanded the withdrawal of both American and Soviet armies, and the adoption of a national constitution and formation of a united national government by representatives elected through a national election. In addition to this, communists conceded on many points in favor of the right wing, favoring the creation of a united Korea over an explicitly communist one. The idea of the proletarian dictatorship was scrapped in favor of a more democratic government in the traditional Western sense of the word, and also conceded on allowing private property rights, stating that the new government would recognize private property with only a few stipulations restricting the creation of monopolies. One of the Korean delegates from the South that represented the more right wing faction of the Congress was Kim Koo. Now, Kim Koo was a dedicated anti communist, but even so, he spent his entire life dedicated to genuine Korean independence. As a teenager, he took part in peasant revolts. At 20 years old, he killed a Japanese man who he suspected was a lieutenant in the Imperial Army, and he also spent decades in exile from Korea, organizing guerrilla fighters to fight against the Japanese in China. Even though he was an anti communist, the very clear involvement of America in the creation of South Korea and the way that the elections would be held convinced him that this was not the creation of an independent Korea, but rather cementing an American puppet state occupying Korea again. The reason I bring up Kim Koo is because although he rejected the legitimacy of the South Korean elections, he was actually forced to run in them against his will. The UN elections couldn't just run Syngman Rhee. They needed someone to at least look like he was running against. The US military government had a difficult time finding people because they couldn't just run a Korean collaborator, nobody would have accepted those results, and most nationalists who didn't participate were also opposed to the partitioning of their country. Even though he very publicly denounced the elections and opposed the creation of a South Korean government, his name was put on the ballot without his permission or knowledge. After the creation of the Republic of Korea, Kim Koo continued criticizing the government as illegitimate until he was assassinated one night in 1949 while reading in his study. The assassin was An Do-hee, and he would serve 1 year in jail before being released by Syngman Rhee. In the 90s, An sent a confession of the murder to South Korean newspapers, where he revealed that the assassination of Kim Koo had been ordered by Syngman Rhee's head of national security. A decade after that, declassified documents from the US military had also revealed that he was working as a US counterintelligence officer. It was the result of Korean-wide elections held secretly in the South that formed the very first Supreme National Assembly. Although the goal was unification, the creation of the Republic of Korea forced the North Koreans to form their own state. In September 1948, the assembly convened for the first time, drafted the constitution, and Kim Il-sung was elected the premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Both the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea rejected each other's legitimacy and claimed the position of being the true Korean government over the entire country. After its establishment, the DPRK asked both the Soviet and American military to leave the peninsula, and to leave the country in the hands of the Korean people. The last Soviet troops left in Christmas of that year. American troops remain to this day. If the Korean War is taught in American schools at all, it is almost always talked about in the following way: that there were two Koreas, one Russian and one American, and then one day, for no reason at all, the North Koreans attacked our completely independent and innocent country. But the truth is, as I hope it's already become clear, much more complicated than that. For one, neither of these two governments accepted each other as a legitimate government, and they both considered each other to be a foreign occupying force and made it very clear that they would be willing to bring reunification by force. According to Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett, who was actually in both China and Korea during this period, according to my own still complete investigation, the war started in August-September of 1949 and not in June 1950. Repeated attacks were made along key sections of the 38th parallel throughout the summer of 1949 by Rhee's forces, aiming at securing jump-off positions for a full-scale invasion of the North. What happened later was that the North Korean forces simply decided that things had gone far enough, and that the next assault by Rhee's forces would be repulsed, that having exhausted all possibilities of peaceful unification, those forces would be chased back and the South liberated. Contrary to what is popularly thought to have happened, both the DPRK and the ROK were already in active conflict with each other before the war officially began, and in the year leading up to the war, hundreds of soldiers on both sides had already been killed. From the perspective of Kim Il-sung, the DPRK government and many Koreans in the South The Republic of Korea was a foreign imposition on the peninsula that solidified a permanent separation. For many Koreans, and certainly for Kim Il sung, the creation of the Republic of Korea was the start of the war, an intentional provocation that the United States knew would lead Korea towards war. William Polk, a U.S. State Department advisor, said this himself. If the state was allowed to stand, that action, as Kim Il sung clearly understood, would have prevented unification. He regarded it as an act of war. The situation was not made better by the increased political repression of any dissent towards the government of Syngman Rhee, with reports coming in of tens of thousands massacred at Jeju Island, the massacre of thousands of others, and the imprisonment of tens of thousands more. In the 2 years leading up to the war, the South Korean government had already killed up to 200,000 Koreans and imprisoned 100,000 more. To Kim Il sung, this was the US government taking advantage of the absence of the DPRK government to kill people that were strong supporters of Korean reunification. By 1949, Kim Il sung was already planning the invasion of the Republic of Korea and the destruction of the rest of the American military and the collaborator government. The Army of North Korea had only recently been established the previous year, and although a lot of guerrilla veterans who had fought the Japanese were a part of it, Kim Il sung went to Joseph Stalin to seek military assistance. For several months, Stalin rejected any plan to invade the South, wanting to avoid any possible direct military confrontation with the United States, as the USSR had just lost around 27 million people during the Second World War. Stalin suggested that Kim Il sung seek out the military assistance of Mao Zedong, and once Mao had given his word that Chinese troops would help North Korea should they need it, Stalin also agreed to provide some military assistance, although Soviet troops in Korea was a clear red line. Now, the way that the US obtained a UN mandate to join the war on behalf of South Korea is by framing the invasion as one country committing an act of aggression against another by crossing a recognized border. But this framing does not reflect the on-the-ground reality. Both of these countries saw themselves as the sole legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Neither of them recognized the 38th parallel as a legitimate border, and the other government was recognized as a foreign occupying power. Whether the Americans or the Soviets thought either the North or the South was the legitimate government of Korea is irrelevant. Both the North and the South recognized themselves as the sole legitimate Korean government, and a country cannot invade itself. The Korean War began as a civil war, with two different governments and economies fighting for control over territory that they both claimed to be theirs. The idea that some in the West like to portray, that of an unprovoked random attack between two peaceful neighbors, is completely divorced from reality. It doesn't acknowledge the entire history that led up to the creation of the two Korean governments. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that most Koreans rejected the creation of the Republic of Korea as the first step to officially and permanently separate Korea. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that the South Korean government was formed using votes from only in the South after a period of repression that banned any discussion of unification, or that the North Korean Assembly was formed by votes from Koreans across the entire peninsula, or that there was no recognized border being crossed. The Korean War would be fought in 3 phases. On June 25, 1950, North Korean soldiers already engaged in fighting with South Korean soldiers along the 38th parallel broke through their defenses. In just 3 days, the North Korean army had liberated Seoul, and what remained of the ROK and US military was cornered into the southern tip of the peninsula. Before the war had officially started, the South Korean government was already engaged in a guerrilla war with Koreans who wanted to fight for the end of the American-backed government and for unification. And these guerrillas really helped the North regain as much territory as possible as fast as they did. Right after the war had started, Syngman Rhee and several other South Korean officials fled Korea immediately, and it looked like, had the US and the UN not intervened, Korea could have been reunified in less than a week, and the vast majority of the death and destruction that would occur in the following years could have been avoided. Unfortunately, though, the US, with the help of UN forces, would land in Korea in mid-September, and within 2 weeks, unable to hold back the American and South Korean military, North Korean soldiers retreated back behind the 38th parallel. The US was able to receive the amount of support from the UN that they did because during this time, the countries involved in the UN were almost all American allies, biasing the organization and its actions heavily towards its favor. The UN had denied the People's Republic of China a seat and had given its seat to instead Chiang Kai shek's Republic of China. And as an act of solidarity, the USSR was also boycotting the UN at the time, leaving only Yugoslavia to be the sole dissenting voice against further UN involvement in the Korean War, a voice that could be completely ignored. This is significant because although neither North or South Korea recognized this parallel as a border and neither of these armies could have invaded territory that they both claimed to govern, the United States did officially recognize this as a border and was invading another country. Even though the US had used the parallel as an excuse to divide Korea and to bring the UN into the war, members of the government clearly did not believe it to be a real border either. Warren Austin, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, stated in a speech delivered to the UN to bring support for invading the North, the aggressor's forces should not be permitted to have refuge behind an imaginary line, which has no basis for existence in law or reason. Since the beginning of the occupation of Korea, the US has been able to pick and choose in which reality it wanted to live in, depending on which reality would justify the actions it wanted to carry out. With the support of UN forces, the US pushed into North Korea, and by December 1950, the US had occupied 90% of the entire Korean peninsula. It was during this time that the US directly attacked Chinese territories, intentionally provoking China to join the war so that the war could be expanded. When Douglas MacArthur was asked in an interview whether he thought China would join the war, he responded, "I pray nightly that they will. I would get down on my knees." In the third phase of the war, as the American and UN forces inched closer and closer to the Chinese and Soviet border, China officially joined the war in January 1951, and Soviet military assistance began to be delivered. The North Korean and Chinese forces were briefly able to push South Korean, US, and UN troops back to recapture Seoul until the South Koreans pushed the front line back to the 38th parallel a few months later. The fighting would remain in this area for the rest of the war. Up until the nationalists had fled mainland China to Taiwan, the US had been supporting them as a major anti-communist power in East Asia, but when they lost, the US began to turn its attention to Japan. Quoting A.B. Abrams, an expert on international relations in the Asia-Pacific region, in Japan itself, the imperial order was largely kept intact but placed under new American directives, with the country's economy rebuilt even more heavily dependent than before on trade with the US and Western powers, while American intelligence agencies deeply penetrated and intervened heavily in Japanese politics, including its elections. As MIT professor and historian John Dower noted, it was difficult to imagine a sovereign Japan as anything other than dependent on and subordinate to the United States, a client state in all but name. After the war, the new Japanese constitution called for a permanent renouncement of violence, that Japan would never again be a nation involved in war. But when the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist forces, unexpectedly lost the war, the US realized that they would need more military forces in the region than previously thought, and so the US government, after their incredibly popular pacifist constitution in Japan was accepted, was forced to pressure the island to remilitarize. In 1950, the US asked the new Japanese government to create a standing military force of around 300,000 people. The new government, knowing very well that this would be an incredibly unpopular policy and would likely destabilize an already unstable system, decided that they would remilitarize, but much slower than the Americans wanted. And thus, by 1952, 7 years after the end of the Second World War and the signing of a constitution that certified pacifism as government policy, Japan had a standing military force full of soldiers and officers that had fought under the imperial flag of around 100,000. The war in Korea also allowed the US to permanently cement military bases in Japan, with an estimated 120 military bases in Japan still existing to this day. In addition to these changes, the economic benefit that Japan received from the war cannot be understated. Following the end of the Second World War, Japan's economy was almost completely destroyed, but once the war in Korea had broken out, the US and the UN again looked at Japan as a way of producing everything they needed, from uniforms to machinery to weapons. Billions of dollars were invested into the Japanese economy that gave it a major boost and allowed Japan to quickly reindustrialize itself. The Korean War had saved Japan, and the longer it went on, the more Japan could profit. Shigeru Yoshida, the Prime Minister of Japan during this time period, referred to the Korean War as a gift from the gods. But if the US was benefiting from the war by having an opportunity to wipe out an independent Korean government, and Japan was benefiting by the economic investments and the remilitarization it was allowed to do, then what was this gift from the gods' effect on the people of Korea itself? To accurately give a description of the violence suffered by the civilians on the ground, I've split this into two different categories: the US and UN bombings in the north, and violence from the soldiers and policemen in the south. The bombing of Korea began almost right as the war had begun. By October 1950, virtually the entire North Korean Air Force had been destroyed, and so for the majority of the war, with the exception of a few Soviet and Chinese planes that would later assist North Korea, the US and UN military forces enjoyed complete control over the airspace of all of Korea. Although during the first few months the US had a policy of only carrying out precision bombings in heavily populated civilian areas, this policy was quickly dropped by the US command as the war went on. By November, George Edward Stradmeyer, the commander of the Air Forces, requested permission from General MacArthur to begin a firebombing campaign of several villages in Korea. MacArthur responded, "Burn it if you so desire." Not only that, Strat, but burn and destroy as a lesson to any of those towns that you consider of military value to the enemy. That evening, Stratmeyer wrote in his diaries, "Every installation, facility, and village in North Korea now becomes a military and tactical target." By the end of the war, virtually all of North Korea had been destroyed. Every single village in North Korea, without exception, had been the target of a fire or napalm bombing. North Korean sources estimated more than 428,000 bombs were dropped on Pyongyang alone, the number more than that of Pyongyang citizens at that time. The US had completely reduced the whole territory of Korea into ashes by showering bombs of nearly 600,000 tons, 3.7 times greater than those dropped on Japan during the Pacific War, even using napalm bombs prohibited by the international conventions. Some may consider it strange to use the North Korean government as a source, but the statements of American soldiers and the writings of neutral observers actually make the reality seem even worse than this. In 1951, war correspondent Tibor Mare wrote that he had witnessed a complete devastation between the Yalu River and the capital, that there were no more cities in North Korea. My impression was that I am traveling on the moon because there was only devastation. Every city was a collection of chimneys. By the end of the war, the US military had carried out an assessment of the damage on 22 North Korean cities, finding that numerous cities had more than 80% of its infrastructure completely destroyed. Towards the end of the war, when most cities and villages had already been burned to the ground, the US turned its attention to some of the only infrastructure left standing: water dams. The targeted bombing of these dams caused a massive flood in parts of Korea that destroyed thousands of acres of fields that Koreans relied on for food, condemning millions of Koreans to starvation. Stephen Gowans summarizes the destruction of Korea as follows. Estimates range from 3 to 4.5 million, with Koreans accounting for 2.3 to 3 million deaths. Chinese fatalities in the war ranged from an estimated 600,000 to 1 million. US fatalities were a comparatively insignificant 36,574, 1 to 2% of the total. Given that the population of Korea in 1950 was approximately 20 million, the war destroyed 10 to 15% of the population. Charles Armstrong estimates that the fraction of Koreans killed is in the range of the proportion of Soviet citizens killed in World War II. About 2.3 million Japanese perished in the Pacific War, or roughly 3% of the population, much lower than the Korean nationality in the 1950 to 1953 Holocaust. Curtis LeMay, who directed the terror bombing, estimated that, over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population? After the war had ended, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk boasted, Everything that moved in North Korea, every brick standing on top of another, we bombed. Although the US bombings did occasionally target villages in South Korea, the majority of these victims were concentrated in the north. The victims in South Korea befell a different fate. During the 2 years that Syngman Rhee was the president of the Republic of Korea before the war, hundreds of thousands of leftists were victims of persecutions and assassinations at the hands of the state. In addition to this, the ROK had an official policy of re-education for a wide variety of people considered to be unreliable to the new government that included communists, unification activists, and people who advocated for better working conditions. To escape the immediate punishment of an execution or imprisonment, an estimated 300,000 of these unreliable Koreans would be enrolled into the Bodo Leagues, a state-sponsored re-education movement. Before the war had broken out, the League seemed like it could possibly be a second chance to escape death or hard labor of political opponents to Rhee's regime. But once the war had started, the list's true purpose revealed itself. A kill list for the South Korean government that stated the name, addresses, and known family members and friends of people who might welcome the North Korean army, liberating them from an American occupation. Not even 48 hours after the North invaded, Syngman Rhee ordered the execution of thousands of people on this list, as well as any suspected members of the underground Korean Workers' Party. What followed was the mass rounding up of suspected leftists, unification activists and their families, and the mass execution of Koreans across all of the South. A US officer present in Korea estimated that in between June and September 1950, Syngman Rhee's government had killed more than 100,000 South Koreans without any trial. Those who were not killed were put into what British journalist James Cameron called a concentration camp. Writing about his experiences, Cameron wrote, "I had seen Belsen, but this was worse. This terrible mob of men convicted of nothing, untried, South Koreans in South Korea, suspected of being unreliable. There were hundreds of them. They were skeletal, puppets of string, faces translucent gray, mangled to each other with chains, cringing in the classic Oriental attitude of subjection, the squatting fetal position, in piles of garbage." This story would not be published in the British press, however. The owner of the newspaper fired the editor that had hired Cameron and suppressed any news coming out of Korea that put the US and South Korea in a bad light, deeming it to be communist propaganda. Censoring of the massacres were not only being carried out in Europe, but in America itself. I.F. Stone's book-length investigative report titled The Hidden History of the Korean War was first published in 1952, thus revealing the unpublicized events of the war as it was still being waged, but the appearance of the book was met with an almost complete press blackout and boycott. It vanished as soon as it could materialize. It is rumored that even copies of the Spanish translation were bought up en masse and destroyed by the US Embassy in Mexico. In 1970, a second edition was published with a publisher's note that the re-release of the book was urgently relevant to the Vietnam peace negotiations. Prefacing the title on the cover of the 1970 edition are the words, "America's First Vietnam." In fact, some of this censorship was more voluntary than would be expected. American newspapers, funded by American businessmen, wanted to make the state look good, and so while the beginning of the war they welcomed all the information available, as the Chinese and North Korean forces were able to push the Americans back further than expected, and as news of massacres became harder to ignore, a policy of voluntary censorship was taken by the newspapers in order to not interfere with morale. Throughout the American and European press, North Korean and Chinese military forces were repeatedly accused by the US of massacres of South Koreans and prisoners of war. The numbers of alleged victims of North Korean massacres had been in the hundreds of thousands during the war, but after the war was over, the highest number of victims that the US could realistically claim was under 30,000. To put this number in comparison, These 30,000 included members of the South Korean military and police forces killed over a period of 3 years, whereas the South Korean government had killed more than 100,000 civilians in their own country in just the first few months of the war. The United States, far from a passive observer in these crimes, was complicit in the massacres and had actually used them in their propaganda. When they weren't directly carrying them out, such as in the No-Gun-Ri massacre, they were present during several South Korean massacres and labeling them as North Korean ones. Quoting A.B. Abrams once again, "The scenes of mass killing on a tremendous scale and of women holding babies in mass graves were terrible, but also an excellent opportunity for propagandists intent on delegitimizing and vilifying the North Korean government. The massacres were thus intentionally falsely attributed to North Korean forces, with American observers collecting and publicizing extensive footage of the remains, but mislabeling it as evidence of enemy war crimes." And no discussion of the violence suffered by Koreans during the war would be complete without a specific examination of the violence suffered by Korean women. Under the US occupation beginning in 1945, sexual violence and coercion grew into a new comfort women system operated and expanded on by Americans. As the Korean-American political scientist Catherine Moon puts it, sex slaves of the Japanese military serve as the historical prototype of US-oriented prostitution in Korea. This system began almost immediately after the American occupation had begun, although there is no clear distinction between the system of sexual slavery set up by the Japanese and the system of camptown prostitution for the US military. In Korean cultural memory, the birth of the Yanggongju dates back to the early days of the war, when US soldiers set up camp near small towns and villages. One camptown sex worker recalled that US soldiers would break into homes of private Korean citizens and rape women, housewives, and young virgin girls. During the first few weeks of the war, Korean families began the practice of hiding their daughters when American soldiers passed through their village, or, alternatively, sacrificing them to pacify the men's sexual appetites. Although most of the villagers did successfully protect their women, there were rumors about men who allegedly traded time with their daughters for American cigarettes and gum. While the idea of comfort women under the Japanese imperial rule is often thought to simply be the kidnapping of women to be sold into slavery, and it very often was, there were also coercive contracts and offers provided to communities to make the comfort women seem, on the surface, as something that Korean and Chinese women had willingly agreed to. In Nanjing, for example, Japanese soldiers approached communities with offers that they wanted a certain number of women to quote-unquote volunteer to become comfort women, under the threat of a massacre of that community. Under the US military government in Korea, and then under US military presence in the Republic of Korea, a very similar system was set up. South Korea was incredibly poor during this time, with very high unemployment numbers and food insecurity, and many people living in Korea starved and lived off of the bare minimum. This, of course, excludes American soldiers. They were so well cared for by the US government that during the holidays, traditional American holiday foods like turkey and pumpkin pie were delivered to soldiers, even those fighting on the front line. This is how they were treated, even as Koreans around them were literally starving to death. Is it any surprise then that as a new way of coercing women into sexual favors, as the Japanese had done, food and other American commodities were offered in exchange for Korean women and girls to, quote-unquote, voluntarily enter into sexual relations with American soldiers? By 1953, there were around 350,000 of these women working as prostitutes in South Korea, forced to trade sexual favors for food or for American products that they could then sell on the market and provide income for their families. This system did not end after the Korean War, but was actually expanded, and it is conservatively estimated that around 1 million women had worked as prostitutes for the American military in between 1950 and 1990. Just as we can observe under the Japanese comfort women system that there could not really be any semblance of a free choice made by women under the threat of a massacre, there can also not be any semblance of a free choice made by women under the American system either, where they were being threatened with literal starvation. And although prostitution was technically made illegal in 1946 by the US military, their official position on this entire system was, the US military does not condone prostitution, but whatever Korean civilians make available is beyond our control. And then of course there was the end of the war. During Phase 3 of the war, when both sides got locked into a front that would not move much for the remainder of the war, talks of a possible armistice between the North and the UN forces began. The US had refused to stop fighting until all outstanding issues had been dealt with, which meant the following 2 years were a back and forth of increased demands from the US and more concessions from the North. When the North Koreans agreed to the American conditions that the ceasefire line should be moved back along the 38th parallel, the Americans then stated that the ceasefire line should be moved further into North Korean territory. When the North Koreans rejected this, the US bombed delegation headquarters in Kaesong, a neutral city, and kept insisting that more territory be ceded to the South. Eventually, the North agreed to give more territory to the South, and the armistice line was settled. But then came the issue of prisoner repatriation. The United States, seeing this as an opportunity to build propaganda against communism, announced in April 1952 that around half of their 130,000 prisoners of war did not want to return back to their homes, but wanted to stay in South Korea. This was especially not acceptable to the North Korean and Chinese side. For Chinese prisoners, most of whom had been communist fighters from during the Civil War, they were being imprisoned by soldiers lent to the UN forces by Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. By early 1952, before an agreement on prisoners of war had been reached, the US had already announced that it would not be returning all POWs, and prison guards had been given a shoot-to-kill order to put down any protests. Martin Hart-Landsberg writes, Admiral Choi wrote in his diary that any prisoner wanting to return home was either beaten black and blue or killed. The majority of prisoners of war were too terrified to frankly express their choice. 2 translators working for the State Department told Choi that an honest screening would have likely resulted in 85% of the Chinese prisoners expressing their desire to go back to the mainland, not the recorded 15%. To accurately describe the conditions in which North Korean or Chinese prisoners of war would accept repatriation, I will quote A.B. Abrams once again. Comparisons of prison camps where Chinese and North Koreans were held to Nazi concentration camps were common in internal U.S. reports. U.S. Ambassador to South Korea John Muccio alleged that the Taiwanese representatives involved in repatriation were members of Chiang Kai-shek's Gestapo. He passed on reports that Chinese prisoners were being forced under severe threat to sign petitions in blood and undergo tattooing to prove that they were anti-communists and wanted to go to Taiwan. One report from a prisoner stated, regarding the enforcement of this policy, in early 1952, the brigade leader Lee Da-an wanted to tattoo every prisoner in Compound 72 with an anti-communist slogan. He ordered the prison guards to beat those who refused the tattoo in front of the 5,000 prisoners. Some of those who couldn't stand the beatings gave up and agreed to the tattoo. One prisoner, however, Lin Chuapu, continued to refuse the tattoo. Lee Dan finally dragged Lin up to the stage and in a loud voice asked Lin, "Do you want it or not?" Bleeding and barely able to stand up, Lin, a 19-year-old college freshman, replied with a loud no. Lee Da-an responded by cutting off one of Lin's arms with his dagger. Lin screamed, but still shook his head when Lee repeated the question. Humiliated and angry, Lee followed by stabbing Lin with his dagger. Lee yelled to all the prisoners in the field, "Whoever dares to refuse the tattoo will be like him." In the end, around 22,000 prisoners would not be returned to either North Korea or China. By 1953, President Eisenhower was directly threatening both North Korea and China with a nuclear bomb. Thankfully, due to internal resistance to a nuclear war and, more importantly, fear of Soviet retaliation, this did not happen. But the North Korean and Chinese forces would concede again and accept that tens of thousands of their prisoners of war in South Korea would not be returned home. On July 27, 1953, the United States, North Korea, and China would sign the armistice that would bring an end to the fighting. Syngman Rhee, who had wanted the war to continue, refused to sign the armistice. To make him refrain from attacking the North, the US signed a defense treaty with the Republic of Korea that would cement a permanent American presence in the country, as well as place the South Korean military under US command. Following the Korean War, Syngman Rhee had dropped all pretenses of democracy and was running South Korea as a full-blown police state. In 1956, he had won the elections, but an opposition candidate, Cho Bong-am, a social democrat that advocated for a peaceful reunification, had still managed to gain 30% of the vote, more than anybody had expected. So Rhee accused him of being a North Korean spy and had him executed the following year. Rhee, who had been following the economic advice of Americans, had kept Korea as a mostly agrarian raw material export-oriented country with a very underdeveloped economy. North Korea, on the other hand, up until the 70s, was actually doing much better than South Korea, and as a result, Syngman Rhee was becoming a less and less popular leader. During the following elections in 1960, Rhee had won the presidency again, but this time nobody accepted it. The process of how these elections took place is described by Stephen Gowans. In the weeks leading up to the March 1960 election, Rhee supporters routinely beat opposition supporters. On voting day, March 15th, ballot boxes disappeared from areas in which the opposition was expected to win. At the same time, ballots were stuffed with fraudulent votes. All of this happened in full view of US and UN election observers who, Bruce Cummings observed, apparently were present to legitimate, not monitor, the validity of the election. In what is dubbed the April Revolution, thousands of students and workers took to the streets to demand that Rhee be removed as president, that American soldiers leave South Korea, and that the government would begin to work towards a reunification. The protests quickly turned violent, and politicians such as the vice president were being attacked in their homes. The people would no longer accept Syngman Rhee as president, and with no other options, Rhee did what almost every US-installed military dictator does at the end of their career, packed his bags, and fled to the US, where he would live the last 5 years of his life in Hawaii before dying of a stroke at the age of 90. With Syngman Rhee gone, Prime Minister Chang Myon became the new leader of the Republic of Korea. He had been an advocate for democracy and criticized political repression when he was an opposition leader against Syngman Rhee, but now that he was the leader, he had to deal with the mass protests and political discontent against the government. Besides calling the protesters communist agitators and sending the police to repress them, many of the actions he took didn't directly meet any of the protesters' demands, and workers and student unions began to organize themselves politically. By May 1961, the National Student League for Unification had met with members from all over South Korea and passed a resolution stating that they would be attending a North-South student union to discuss the matter of reunification. The North Korean student unions happily agreed to this proposal, and the date for that conference was set to be May 20th, 1961. Although the vast majority of Koreans had wanted a peaceful reunification, the Republic of Korea's strictly anti-communist government and military that had been built up by the US could not accept that students would themselves begin to work towards unification with a communist government. And so, on May 16th, 4 days before the conference was going to take place, the government was overthrown in a coup d'etat led by military general Park Chung-hee. Although Syngman Rhee and the United States had laid the foundations of what South Korea was and is, it's really Park Chung-hee and his successor, Chun Do-hwan, who made South Korea into the country it is today. Recently, among South Koreans polled, Park Chung-hee rates as one of, if not the most popular, South Korean leader post-1945, and his influence into Korean politics today is still very large. As of recently, his daughter Park Yoon-hee was also the president of South Korea before being arrested and sentenced to 25 years in prison on corruption charges in 2017. And movies critical of him have been victims of government censorship, with South Korean courts ordering the removal of parts of a film critical of him before it could be released domestically. So, who was Park Chung-hee before he rose to power in the 1961 government coup? Well, you remember how I mentioned in the beginning of the video that the North Korean government took an active effort to expel Japanese collaborators from the country, and that the US military government actively recruited and rehabilitated Japanese collaborators to fill the military and police? Well, Park Chung-hee was one of those collaborators that benefited from the American rehabilitation of his image. At the age of 22, desperate to be accepted into a Japanese military academy, he swore a blood oath to the Japanese Empire and changed his Korean name into a more Japanese one, Takagi Masao. In this military academy, he graduated at the top of his class and by the end of the Second World War was serving in the army of Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state set up in China. After the war, he fled to South Korea, where he was reintegrated into the Republic of Korea's military, and by 1960, he had become chief of the operations staff of the South Korean army, one of the army's most powerful positions. Unhappy with how Syngman Rhee and later Chang Myung were handling the economic crisis, seeing how close students on both sides of the peninsula were to establish some path towards unification, he organized to overthrow the government. Where Park Chung-hee differs from most American-backed military dictators, however, is that he was not the completely subservient military general that had no real economic plans for their country like Syngman Rhee had been, or Chile's dictator Augusto Pinochet, whose economic policy was almost entirely guided by American economists, would be. While he was still working in the army for Syngman Rhee, Park Chung-hee was very involved in intelligence units that monitored and studied North Korea, especially the North Korean economy. It was during this time that, ironically, Park Chung-hee began to develop his economic plans for how he would develop South Korea, by taking parts of the North Korean development model that had been outpacing South Korea in economic growth for more than a decade now and applying them to the South. Many of the policies that Park implemented in South Korea were directly the opposite of what the American government had been advising Rhee and Chang to do. Whereas the US was happy to leave South Korea a third world country that could provide it cheap labor and resources, Cold War realities forced them to be open to other possibilities. North Korea was growing economically, and the South Korean government was increasingly unpopular and unable to deal with rising food and job insecurity, not to mention the pressure from South Koreans to open a path towards reunification. In other situations where third world countries tried to pursue economic policies that would harm Western investment and were inspired by communist countries, the US would quickly swoop in with a regime change. But South Korea, a country militarily occupied by the US, with no independent military or means of self-defense, led by a man who was committed to both the USA and anti-communism, was allowed more opportunities than most. It also helped that one of Park Chung-hee's first actions as president was preventing the North-South Student Conference from taking place, and one of his first statements as president of South Korea being, "Anti-communism is the first purpose of the government." And so, under Park Chung-hee, South Korea rapidly developed in the following 2 decades in what is often dubbed the Miracle on the Han River. South Korea is frequently held up as an example to the rest of the Third World as a country that was quickly able to develop through the miracle of the free market. Ironically, though, many of the policies that South Korea implemented during this time are in direct contradiction to the policies recommended by the IMF and the WTO today. Unlike these organizations that hold up a completely free market as the path towards economic development, the South Korean government under Park Chung-hee was an incredibly protectionist country that heavily controlled foreign investment, used tariffs that regulated the country's imports and exports, and pursued a partially planned economy, even implementing 5-year plans that were used in communist countries like the Soviet Union, China, and the DPRK. Let's listen to a snippet of an interview with the economist Martin Hart-Landsberg.
South Korea was a very poor country in 1960. By the end of the 80s into the 90s, it was widely considered a success story. And so international agencies go around and they say, oh, you're doing so poor. You need to do like what South Korea does. And South Korea is a free market miracle. And so, for example, I was in South Korea in the early 90s after the Soviet Union ended, and the IMF had a tour group of people from some of the Eastern European countries, but some from Africa, some from Latin America, and they were there to learn about the South Korean miracle. And they were told by Korean professors, oh, this is, they welcomed foreign investment, they were open to free trade, the government stayed out of the economy, and that's how they succeeded, which is not the case. And I want to go back to that in a second. But I visited this professor and I said, I hear you're telling them that X, Y, and Z. That's not my understanding. And he said, no, it's not mine either. But the IMF wants this story out. So it puts pressure on the president of the university who tells me, and I do this.
To clarify what is being said here, the IMF and the World Trade Organization instructed South Korean economists and professors to lie to economists and government officials from underdeveloped countries seeking advice about what policies to pursue in order for those countries to implement economic policies that would make them both easier to exploit and keep them underdeveloped. So, what were the economic policies that Park Chung-hee implemented that turned South Korea into the country it is today? Contrary to the claim that South Korea developed due to its acceptance of the free market, the South Korean economy was highly protectionist while it underwent most of its growth. Under Park, foreign trade and investment in the South Korean economy was heavily regulated, and the banking system was nationalized so that the state itself could allocate which companies would receive credit. Government industries such as the Economic Planning Board and the Ministry of Trade and Industry were created to carefully control investment and trade activities. In addition, members of the military loyal to Park were placed as presidents or vice presidents of various Korean companies, so as to maintain closer control of their activity. Under Ri, South Korea had stayed an underdeveloped economy that relied heavily on the exports of iron, fish, and various vegetables. Under Park Chung-hee, through the use of 5-year economic plans, South Korea slowly transitioned from exporting raw material to an industrialized economy that could export manufactured goods. This development was not done by the magic of the free market, but rather, as Korean economist Byung-Nak Song explains, under the government export promotion strategy, survival of the fittest among competing firms was not determined in the marketplace, but through discretionary government actions. Fitness was judged in terms of the ability to expand exports rather than based on profitability. If determined unfit, firms were likely to face bankruptcy. Such firms were under constant threat of tax investigations and other punitive sanctions. On the other hand, firms that efficiently used their government backed loans to expand exports were implicitly considered fit and favored with even further support. By the end of Park's third 5-year plan, South Korea's exports had transitioned from raw material of the Ri era to shoes, clothes, machinery, telecommunications equipment, and even ships. During the time he ruled South Korea, the gross national product rose faster and higher than most third world countries at the time. Outside of certain free economic zones that the South Korean government set up, where there were very little regulations on investment, most of the country's companies had an outright ban on foreign direct investment, or very strict ceiling caps that restricted how much could be invested. Until the 1990s, South Korea was one of the least FDI dependent nations in the world. The South Korean economist Ha Jun Chang describes the process as so. Producers in developing countries entering new industries need a period of partial insulation from international competition through protection, subsidies, and other measures before they can build up their capabilities to compete with superior foreign producers. In recommending free trade to developing countries, the Bad Samaritans point out that all the rich countries have free-ish trade. This is, however, like people advising the parents of a 6-year-old boy to make him get a job, arguing that successful adults don't live off their parents and therefore that being independent must be the reason for their success. They do not realize that those adults are independent because they are successful and not the other way around. It was during this time that South Korea's chaebols began to grow in power. Corporations that benefited Park Chung-hee's plan for the economy were favored by the government and received both more loans and guarantees that they would not let their company fall. These chaebol families quickly came to completely dominate the entire economy, and throughout the Miracle on the Han River period, only 10 chaebols were responsible for 60% of the economic growth. By 1988, the combined revenue of the top 4 chaebol, Samsung, Hyundai, Lucky Gold Star, and Daewoo, totaled almost half of the country's GNP. These handful of companies exert an enormous amount of influence over the South Korean government and economy, which has led to countless cases of corruption and scandals about secret ties to government officials. Although Park Chung-hee's economic policies developed the South Korean economy and made him popular internationally and with the US, his actions inside of Korea have made his popularity somewhat of a controversial topic. Although Park enjoyed some support in the 1960s due to the immediate benefit people felt and the sheer unpopularity of Syngman Rhee, by the 1970s his popularity was beginning to decline. In the 60s, Park won his election with bribes, false votes, and some genuine support. But by 1970, nobody was buying his legitimacy within the country, and his rule turned into an outright dictatorship. Claiming an imminent threat of a North Korean attack, Park Chung-hee declared martial law and rewrote the constitution, giving him the ability to appoint and recall members of the National Assembly at will and get rid of limits on how long he could be president. Although Park had been ruling in an authoritarian way, the increase in repression and the now open dictatorship was necessary for South Korea to remain developing in the way that it had been. Even though the country had been developing rapidly, the wealth was concentrated in the hands of very few people, and the living conditions of most Koreans continued to deteriorate during this period. In order to make Korean exports more competitive, Park needed to create a large labor force to work in newly emerging industries for cheap. For example, the government set price caps for agricultural products that crippled farmers' incomes, reduced the amount of government loans and investments in the agricultural sector, and shifted to importing food from abroad. Policies that all but forced farmers to abandon their work and move to urban centers to become low-wage laborers. Quoting Martin Hart-Landsberg, in 1978, it was the #1 third world exporter of manufactures to the developed capitalist world. Rarely noted was the fact that South Korean manufacturing workers suffered through the world's longest work week under oppressive conditions in exchange for extremely low wages. Government statistics for 1978 show that approximately 2/3 of all manufacturing workers earned monthly wages below the national average. Approximately 40% earned below the government-defined subsistence wage level. The average manufacturing worker received $40 a month. In textiles, young women earned only $25 a month. To put these figures in perspective, the Bank of Korea calculated at the same time that an urban family of 4 needed $90 a month for survival. As workers became more and more concentrated in urban centers, as their living conditions and income continued to sink, dissent from workers became more and more of a threat to the government. Workers who wanted to organize into labor unions could only do so in the few unions that existed on the condition that they swore allegiance to the Republic of Korea. Workplace fatalities from accidents or exposure to dangerous chemicals or dangerous working conditions were high. Child labor was common, many of whom worked, like their parents, for 7 days a week, 15 hours a day or more, and neither sick or maternity leave was available. During this period, Korean radicals would organize themselves in secret, sometimes communist organizations to plan spontaneous strikes or protests that would be violently repressed. One of these radicals was a young garment worker named Jeon Tae-il. At 16, he dropped out of school to begin working full-time and saw the effects of Park's development firsthand. He tried to organize a labor union in his factory, but any attempts to organize workers was met with increased repression by the company's owners. After 6 years of life as a laborer under Korea's Third Republic, realizing that this government would never allow the change he wished to see, he took to the streets of Seoul in a public act of protest. He poured gasoline over his body in the street and lit himself on fire. running down the streets yelling workers' slogans like, "We workers are human beings too. We are not machines," before collapsing. He was still alive when he was brought to the hospital where he was met by his mother. The doctors told her that the medicine that could relieve her son of his pain would cost 15,000 won, money that neither of them had. And so, Jeon Tae-il would spend the last hours of his life by his mother's side in unbearable pain before finally passing away 6 hours later. Journalists who looked through his personal writings found a letter that he had written to Park Chung-hee that he had never managed to send. It read, "Your Excellency, President, I am a tailor with 5 years of experience in the garment industry. My workplace is the Peace Market in Dongdaemun-gu, Seoul, which boasts a large scale in the garment sector. Of course, I know it is a company subject to the Labor Standards Act. However, we workers receive none of the benefits of the Labor Standards Act, and over 90% of the 20,000 employees are women with an average age of 18. A 15-hour workday is too excessive. Assistant workers who make up 40% of the 20,000 workers are as young as 15. Please protect these innocent and pure young hearts before they are further damaged." In addition to the violence endured from day-to-day life in Korea during this time, Park Chung-hee had also built on an expanded Syngman-ri's police state. In 1948, along with the creation of the Republic of Korea, Syngman-ri had passed the National Security Law, a law which effectively outlaws any anti-capitalist, anti-government, or pro-reunification sentiment. Park, like Ri before him, used this law to imprison anybody deemed critical of the government. In helping carry out this law, Park founded the KCIA, the Korean Central Intelligence Agency that operated, in the words of American foreign policy consultant William R. Polk, like the Gestapo. Quoting Stephen Gowans, "The KCIA was ubiquitous, infiltrating its agents into newspaper offices, radio stations, TV networks, political parties, discussion groups, trade unions, and classrooms, both in South Korea and abroad. KCIA surveillance was panoptic. Its agents were everywhere and watched everyone all the time. So pervasive was KCIA spying that South Koreans believed it was best to say nothing about politics to anyone, even loved ones. Had the ROK been communist rather than capitalist, it would have been branded a totalitarian state of the very worst kind. So pervasive was the KCIA surveillance that South Koreans abroad, such as in West Germany for example, were sometimes kidnapped by KCIA agents and illegally shipped back to South Korea for either moving to East Germany or for participating in pro-democracy or pro-communist activities. Back home, Koreans deemed to be communists were imprisoned arbitrarily, tortured, and frequently killed. The anti-communism of South Korea in the Park Chung-hee era was so far-reaching that during his rule, it was illegal to even publish a photograph of Kim Il-sung, and a brand of crayons named Picasso were banned for using the name of a communist sympathizer. By the end of the 1970s, Park's already little domestic support was beginning to dwindle. By 1979, Korea had developed, but it had also racked up more than $20 billion in debt, and Park wanted to slow down the economy. In the 60s, he had been able to attract hundreds of millions of dollars in loans and credits from the US and Japan, and the South Korean government had even been paid millions by the US in exchange for sending troops to Vietnam. But by the late 70s, it looked like there was no way out. In October of 1979, Park Chung-hee was attending a private banquet at a KCIA safe house and discussing, among other things, the repression they had released upon anti-government protesters that had recently erupted in the South due to rising inflation. While eating among his guests, Park Chung-hee was shot multiple times in the chest by Kim Jae-gyu, the head of his KCIA and a longtime friend. After Kim's gun jammed, he went to get another, coming back to find Park still alive, and ultimately executing him with a gunshot to the back of his head. The reason behind the assassination remains unclear to this day. After Park's assassination, his prime minister Choi Kyu-ha would become president. In an effort to calm down popular discontent, Choi promised that his administration would bring the country back to democracy, but this promise was promptly interrupted 2 months into his presidency when the military launched another coup, led by military general Chun Du-hwan. Under this third military dictatorship, Chun would maintain most of Park's policies in place for much of his time in power, but the violence that ordinary Koreans faced would once again expand. A prime example of this violence was the government response to mass demonstrations in May of 1980. In Gwangju, one of Korea's largest cities located at the very south of the peninsula, protests erupted upon hearing that the death of Park would not result in a transition to democracy, but rather another military dictatorship. What started as a protest of 2,000 university students quickly grew into a massive uprising after the police began to kill people indiscriminately. A few days after the protests had begun, they had grown to an uprising of hundreds of thousands of people who began to physically resist the police and the military that had been sent to suppress them. The South Korean media refused to report on any news of the uprising, and the military began to block all entrances to the city. Completely disconnected from the rest of South Korea, the protesters began to raid police stations, arm themselves with stolen weapons, burn down the news stations who refused to even report on the riots, and set up people's committees as the entire city faced a military blockade. A week after the uprising had started, the military was ordered to go in and put down the uprising by force, and the army entered Gwangju. An observer describes the scene. They repeated the same action of the day before, beating, stabbing, and mutilating unarmed civilians, including children, young girls, and aged grandmothers. They forced both men and women to strip naked, made others lie flat on the ground, and kicked them. Several sources tell of soldiers stabbing or cutting off the breasts of naked girls. One murdered student was found disemboweled, another with an X carved in his back. About 20 high school girls were reported killed at Central High School. The paratroopers carried out searches in side streets, fired randomly into crowds, and carted off the bodies in trucks, and piled them in the bus terminal. They even took the wounded out of hospitals. By the time the massacre was over, the government claimed it had defeated a planned insurrection by North Korean infiltrators and their communist allies, and had reported that only 144 civilians had died. Although the true number of victims will probably never be confirmed, contemporary scholars and researchers have estimated the real number of victims is probably more than 2,000 to 3,000 people. Upon the news of the massacre becoming public, the United States distanced itself from Chun and the South Korean government and claimed multiple times that it was horrified by the actions of the military. But almost 2 decades later, in 1996, government documents made public revealed that not only was the US, led by Jimmy Carter at the time, fully aware of what the military was planning in Gwangju before it happened, but that the US military had approved of and authorized the sending of the military, still under US command, to crush the protests. Whereas under Ri and Park, violence was targeted at communists, anti-government, labor, and unification activists, under Chun, the Republic of Korea expanded the scope of this violence and undertook a program of social cleansing. Although the Korean middle class had started to feel some stability during this period, the living conditions of the poorest Koreans continued to deteriorate. The growing Korean homeless population and the crime that comes with homelessness was beginning to be a problem for the developed and modern South Korea that Chun had wanted to present to the rest of the world. This system was then intensified when South Korea won the bid to host the Olympics in Seoul in 1988. Camps were opened across Korea to concentrate homeless people, as well as political dissidents and leftists to perform forced labor for Korean companies. To make matters worse, these social purification camps were privately owned and received more government subsidies depending on how many people they could put in these camps. This arrangement led camp administrators to encourage employees to widen the scope of who would need to be socially purified, which led to the taking of orphans, disabled, and sometimes just random people who didn't have an ID card on them. Choi Seung-woo, a 13-year-old who was kidnapped from the street by a police officer, told his story of the camps to the BBC. A police officer asked me to stop and started searching my bag. There was half a loaf of bread, a leftover of my lunch which was given from school. He asked where I stole the bread from. He tortured me, burning my genitals with a lighter. He kept beating me, saying he wasn't going to let me go unless I confessed to the crime. Just wanting to go home, I lied. I stole it, I stole it. The platoon leader and some other guys took all of my clothes off and poured a bucket of cold water on my body. While I was trying to sleep, shivering naked, the platoon leader came again and raped me. He did that to me for 3 consecutive nights until I was transferred to a different platoon. I saw a guy wearing a white robe dragging an inmate across the floor. He seemed dead. He was bleeding all over his body. His eyes were rolling back. The white robe guy didn't care at all and just kept dragging the man somewhere. A few days later, a guy showed some sort of resistance by asking the platoon leader some forbidden questions like, "Why are we trapped in here? Why should we be beaten?" 4 people came and rolled him in a blanket. They kicked him all over his body until he fainted, foaming at the mouth. He never returned to the center. I knew that he had died. When the camps finally closed, tens of thousands of people had passed through them, more than 600 people had been killed, and an unknown number of Korean babies that had been born in the camps had been trafficked to European countries to be adopted by wealthy families. Chun Do-hwan, unlike Park before him, is not remembered very fondly by Korean people today. Not only did his rise to power directly dash the hopes of millions of Koreans who had wanted to transition to a more democratic government, but the naked brutality inflicted against the people of Gwangju and the survivors of his social purification projects had affected a much wider range of people. It also didn't help that he had accepted $200 million in bribes from many of the chaebols and other companies to influence policies. Support for democracy was at an all-time high, and although Chun had wanted to hand the role of president directly to military general Roh Tae-woo, protests erupted so big that the government had finally conceded to voting. With many opposition parties finally having a chance to run in a proper election, the opposition vote was split and Roh Tae-woo was elected anyway. After his term, Kim Yong-sam was elected president of South Korea, marking the first non-military leader in Korea in 30 years. It was around this time, 1993, that the global left was at an all-time low. The Soviet Union had collapsed, Cuba was entering its special period, China had gone through its market reforms, and North Korea was about to enter into a full-blown famine. With the South Korean economy being one of the most developed in the global periphery, the United States decided to hand over operational control of the military back to the South Korean government. To clarify, Park Chung-hee, Chun Do-hwan, and Roh Tae-woo had all held important positions in the military, an organization that was controlled by the United States, so every dictator in South Korea's history came out of an organization that was not controlled by Koreans. So Kim Yong-sam is the first South Korean president, finally in 1993, 45 years after South Korea was founded, who did not directly work for or with the United States military. And since Kim's election, South Korea has continued a more or less democratic transition of power every few years where a handful of liberals run for office, and whoever wins gets a few years of power until they are, inevitably, convicted of corruption or bribery, and sent to prison. As for the Korean economy, Chun and Roh were able to somewhat stabilize the economy via hundreds of millions of import credits from the US, Europe, and Japan. But Korea's highly protectionist economy was also beginning to transform. Kim Yong-sam began to liberalize the Korean economy, and companies began to take advantage of the lessening restrictions in ways that benefited the companies directly, but not so much Koreans or the Korean economy itself. For example, the chaebols in Park's era were being partly subsidized by state funds and had restrictions placed on them where they had to reinvest some of their profits into other industries that would help make the economy more productive. But as the chaebols grew in power, they became less reliant on government support. and by the 80s, the political power of the chaebols allowed them to pursue investment in other areas, such as in stock speculation or in land, things that made life for Koreans more expensive and didn't make Korea more productive. In addition, it was around this period that chaebols began to shift their production to third world countries, meaning that the chaebols were making lots of money by saving on production costs using cheaper third world labor, but that in turn, Koreans who worked for chaebols lost their jobs. Another side effect of the Park era was the growing trade deficit that had been built up over years, and by 1995, that trade deficit had reached 29 billion. Quoting Martin Hart-Landsberg, the economic and political stresses and strains finally became too great. The economy collapsed in 1997. The 49 largest business groups had recorded total profits of just 32 million on combined sales of 274 billion in 1996, a return of just over 0.01%. By November, the South Korean government was almost out of dollars. It gave up its defense of the won, which quickly lost half of its value relative to the dollar. Facing some $160 billion in foreign debt, 90 billion of which required payment within 1 year, the South Korean government in December reluctantly accepted an International Monetary Fund program of structural adjustment in exchange for some 55 billion in loans. The IMF always offers its bailout loans in exchange for implementing new economic policies that it says will help save the economy. But the reality of these structural adjustment programs is almost always to the benefit of foreign, usually American, Japanese, and European companies who can take advantage of the weak position of other countries. South Korea during this time is a prime example. IMF conditions forced the government to open up its economy, lifting limits on how much foreign companies could invest in Korean companies, reforming labor market policies that made it easier to fire workers, raising interest rates, and decreasing government spending on social services. The effects of these policies were almost immediately felt by the South Korean population. The day when the government of Kim Jong-sam signed the letter of intent with the International Monetary Fund was described in the press as a day of national shame, the day that the Korean government lost its sovereignty and was widely compared to the surrender of national sovereignty to the Japanese in 1910. A spokesman for the ruling party's presidential candidate described the IMF as acting like occupation forces and described that the terms encroach on the autonomy of a sovereign state. By 2004, more than 40% of South Korea's market capitalization was owned by foreigners. Almost 80% of Korean households suffered reductions in income, and more than 7% of the country became unemployed. Smaller companies who found it increasingly harder to stay afloat in comparison with the chaebols were forced to sell off all the factories they could, as cheap as they could, to foreigners who now had unrestricted access to the Korean market. Cuts in government spending meant austerity that further worsened the lives of Koreans, and just a few years after that, South Korea's suicide rate doubled, now being considered among the highest in the world even 30 years later. And of course, the worst effects of these policies fell on women, 7 of whom were fired for every 1 man, and to whom the government responded with a national campaign of Get Your Husband Energized, encouraging women to become better housewives and support their husbands if they were depressed or had lost their jobs. Domestically, these policies were a disaster, but internationally, especially in the US, Europe, and Japan, South Korea was praised for finally opening its markets to increased foreign investment. The Economist, a newspaper for British billionaires, praised Samsung, Korea's biggest chaebol, for its mass layoffs, calling it the best-run chaebol for getting rid of 26% of its bloated workforce. Although some of these policies have died down recently, modern Korea still suffers from the restructuring of labor laws implemented by the IMF. Despite the chaebols making up most of South Korea's GDP, they actually provide less and less of the country's jobs, and chaebol interests have been able to influence and bribe the government to get away with more and more. Members of chaebol families, CEOs, and other chairmen are quite frequently charged with embezzlement or bribery of government officials, tax evasion, and even violent assaults, but are just as frequently pardoned by the government or sentenced to very, very light prison sentences. Today, on top of having the highest suicide rate, Korea also has the third highest rate of workplace deaths of countries in the OECD. More than 40% of workers in Korea work irregular jobs, meaning that they cannot find full-time positions and find a variety of part-time or gig jobs to make ends meet. More than 70% of Korean women fall into this irregular or temporary worker category. The average debt in a South Korean household is almost double the annual income. 15% of all South Koreans live in poverty with very limited access to social services, which is not as bad as the almost 50% of elderly Koreans who live in poverty and have to work well into their 80s and 90s. A prime example of the wealth disparity in Korea can be seen in Gangnam District, one of the wealthiest districts in all of Korea. But just a little bit down the road from Gangnam's skyscrapers and penthouses rests Goryeo Village, a slum where thousands of poor Koreans live in shanty houses that are frequently affected by the outbreak of fires. Entering the job market is also becoming increasingly difficult. Although the unemployment rate has dropped by 0.1% in the last year, the number of young adults aged 15 to 29 looking for employment after graduating has increased, 18% of which have remained jobless for at least 3 years while actively looking for a job. And when it comes to social issues, alcoholism is a growing problem, with South Koreans drinking twice as much as Russians and 4 times as much as Americans. And then, of course, there's also the misogyny. In a poll taken by the South Korean government that questioned mostly women, 80% of them reported being sexually harassed in the workplace. Even more shocking, in a separate poll that targeted South Korean men, 80% admitted to being violent against an intimate partner, a statistic that fits in very well with another one that shows that 90% of victims of violent crimes in South Korea are women. And has the violence from the government changed in recent years? Well, there have not been any massacres like those on Jeju Island or at Gwangju, but a closer look shows a government that has returned back to the method of more targeted and specific violence towards specific groups. Workers and trade unions engaged in protests for labor rights are frequently targeted by the Korean police, with hundreds to thousands of workers being arrested for participating in strikes that the government can arbitrarily call illegal. Violence can be inflicted in other ways as well. In 2021, workers protesting outside of the headquarters of LG for better working conditions in the freezing cold of winter had water poured onto them by people hired by the company to force them to leave and find warm shelter. In 2009, after SsangYong Motors laid off almost half of its workforce after it was bought by a foreign company, workers occupied a factory to demand that something be done. Workers inside the factory were cut off from food, water, and electricity, and after nearly 2 months of the factory being occupied, the police entered by force. And after the protest had been cleared, the police then sued the protesters for damage to their equipment, and the fired protesters were not only blacklisted from working in Korean factories, but were also subjected to millions of wons in fines that could not be paid and resulted in protesters losing their homes and cars. More recently, the South Korean government has ordered the preemptive arrest of Korean labor leaders before a strike has even occurred. And then, of course, there is the violence against those who support Korean reunification. In the late 90s, a unification festival was held at Yonsei University, a festival which was quickly deemed to be illegal on the charge that the students of Yonsei University were working on behalf of the North Korean government, and hundreds of students were arrested. More alarming still is the lengths that the Korean police and intelligence service will go to enforce Syngman Rhee's 1948 national security law that outlaws any pro-unification or anti-capitalist speech. Some recent examples of this law being implemented are the arrest of Kim Myung, who was arrested for running a website that sold books by American journalist Edgar Snow, as well as a biography of Karl Marx. Professor Kang Jong-koo was arrested in 2001 for visiting North Korea and for the distribution of North-friendly messages. In 2023, 68-year-old Lee Yeon-seop was sentenced to over a year in prison for breaking the national security law for writing a poem that advocated for unification. In 2015, South Korean citizen Shin Yoon-mi was attacked by a right-wing extremist with acid at an event for a book she had just written about her experiences visiting the North. In response to the attack, she was detained by the police, who questioned her for over 50 hours for breaching the national security law before being deported from the country and banned from re-entering for 5 years. South Korea is also home to some of the longest-serving political prisoners ever, mostly young men who were arrested during the Korean War, who served almost half a century in solitary confinement for not recanting their belief in communism or in unification. Evidence of violence from the past can still be found today, though. In 2011, a mass grave of more than 200 bodies was found near the main airport on Jeju Island, victims of massacres taking place as a response to the founding of the Republic of Korea. Before finally moving on from this section, I need to come back to the American presence in South Korea. Both the Soviet and American military arrived in Korea in 1945. After the North declared itself a country in 1948, the Soviet military left that very year. The American military remains in South Korea until this very day. From the end of the Korean War until the elections of Kim Jong-sam in 1993, operational control of the South Korean military was in the hands of the US. Today, South Korea controls its own military, but only during peacetime. Were a war ever to break out that involved South Korea, the US would regain full operational control of the military. Even if it doesn't involve South Korea, if war were ever to break out with, say, China, the US has shown that it can pressure countries to join into wars that they are not involved in, such as in Vietnam. Even though the American government is trying to portray its military presence in South Korea as a peaceful agreement between two sovereign countries, such as in this article published by the Western-aligned nonprofit Institute for Security and Development Policy, American members of the military have no problem describing the true relationship between these two countries in private as the most remarkable concession of sovereignty in the entire world. Only recently, since the 80s and 90s, have the official brothels for American servicemen been closed, and some very, very light consequences are being established for the people that operated them. But still today, American soldiers stationed in South Korea commit all kinds of crimes, from burglary to rape, where American soldiers can then retreat back to their military base to hide from consequences. The US government says it doesn't deny any access to soldiers who are suspected of committing crimes, and yet an editorial in Seoul newspaper criticized the US military for delaying access by investigators to a 20-year-old rape suspect before the indictment was filed. More than a week has since passed, enough time to change evidence or statement, but law enforcement officials could not have access to the suspect as he is in virtual US territory in Korea. The American military base Camp Humphrey, the largest overseas American military base in the entire world, is permanently home to over 28,500 American servicemen and has cost the taxpayers of America and South Korea $13 billion to maintain between the years 2016 and 2019. One cannot even claim anymore that the American military is there to protect the South from another invasion of the North. For one, the South Korean government has spent significantly more money on their military every year for decades compared to the North, and the American government has openly stated its intention of using South Korea to deter China. Almost every year, the United States and the Republic of Korea's governments conduct war games on the north-south border where they simulate an invasion of North Korea. and every year, protests against the US military presence in the South get bigger and bigger. If you haven't heard about anti-American protests in Korea in the last few years, there is a very intentional reason for that. Tim Sharrock, an American reporter, describes his experience of trying to write about these protests. That Saturday, thousands of people chanting, "This land is not a US war base," demonstrated against Ulchi Freedom Shield, the first large-scale military exercise between US and South Korean forces since 2017. At the demonstration, protesters took direct aim at the heart of US policy in Korea, with signs that read, "No war rehearsal, no US," and "No Korea, US, Japan military cooperation." Outside of the Korean press, the only outlets to cover this massive showing against militarism were Iran's Press TV and China's CGN TV, which provided extensive videos of the mobilization. The single print story on the march appeared in Xinhua, China's daily wire service. Neither the New York Times or the Washington Post, which often set the pace for US coverage of Asia, deemed the demonstration newsworthy. Hypocrisy? Yes. As I put it in a sardonic tweet, every rumor, fake news, intelligence leak, or eyebrow twitch about Kim Jong-un and North Korea gets star treatment in US media. Yet, when thousands of South Koreans march in Seoul against US ROK war games, not one peep. The contrast seemed to hit a nerve. By the weekend, nearly 6,000 Twitter users had liked my post, and over 2,000 had retweeted it. The contradictions were evident on Twitter itself. As it often does with countries we're not supposed to like, it slapped a label on one of my posts about the demonstration, urging users to stay informed because this tweet links to an Iran state-affiliated media website. With that warning, Twitter was effectively delegitimizing my own coverage of the demonstration. As with the censorship of news coming out of South Korea that the US doesn't like, the history, the reality of the relationship between the US and South Korea, the quote-unquote freedom enjoyed by South Koreans to protest their labor rights or advocate for the reunification of their country, the planned economy that led South Korea to rapid development, and the fact that the country was born through a brutal 30-year military dictatorship aided by the US, the image that most Americans and Europeans have of the free and democratic South compared to the totalitarian and repressive North is never anything that is properly investigated. It is just something that is collectively known to be true because of the news and the media that the vast majority of Americans and Europeans consume. But no childhood fairy tale of the peaceful and freedom-loving hero is complete without the barbaric and inherently corrupted villain. So let's go back one final time to 1953, to the end of the Korean War, and take a closer look at the specifics of the story we're always told, before bringing this video back to the core issue that plagues these two countries. By the end of the war, power production in the North was only 26% of what it had been in 1949, fuel 11%, chemicals 22%, and metallurgy 10%. With a temporary peace at the border established, the DPRK had the difficult task of how to rebuild their country after most of its infrastructure had just been completely destroyed or poisoned by the US military. The government of North Korea rebuilt their country by implementing various economic plans, in which strong emphasis was placed on building heavy industry, collectivizing and modernizing the agricultural sector, and building up the North Korean military. A 3-year economic plan was passed for the development of North Korea from 1954 to 1956 that met its targets months ahead of schedule, and for the following decade, the government's economic plans consistently hit its target either on or ahead of schedule. Only a decade after the war had virtually destroyed the entire agricultural sector, North Korea was fully self-sufficient in food production. Up until the 70s, the North Korean economic growth and the living standards of the people was far surpassing that of the South, and Koreans who had still been living in other countries who had to choose between becoming citizens of North or South Korea mostly chose the North. In 1960, for example, Koreans living in Japan were given the choice to receive a passport from one of the two Koreas, and of the 600,000 that wanted to receive a passport, 450,000 of them chose the North. It was during this time of rapid economic growth that Park Chung-hee, serving as an intelligence officer for South Korea, was studying the North Korean economy and the economic plans that have helped them rapidly rebuild. But this growth wouldn't last for long, and during the 70s, economic growth would begin to stagnate. By the end of that decade, South Korea would catch up, and by the 80s, it would surpass them. The reason for this stagnation has lots of factors, both internal and external, but before fully diving in, we need to talk about Kim Il sung and the development of the North Korean government itself. Kim Il sung's vision for the development of Korea and the political line that he constantly pushed in the party was highly influenced by his experience as a guerrilla fighter. Kim Il sung was fully dedicated to the idea of Korean independence, and he saw communism, specifically Marxism Leninism, as the best way to bring this idea to fruition. But the idea of independence in the situation that Korea found itself in needed to be defined. What does independence mean? The DPRK, the legitimate government of Korea as it saw itself, has existed in a permanent state of war for the vast majority of its existence, threatened not only by the government of the South, but also the US, the most powerful country in the world. Not even a decade ago, under the Japanese, Koreans did not have proper access to education facilities, many could not even read or write in Korean, and knew nothing of their own history. And on top of this, the relatively tiny communist DPRK was bordered by the two massive, much more influential People's Republic of China and the USSR. It was not enough for Korea to be independent. It needed to look into itself to develop a truly Korean path of development. For Kim Il sung, this was the idea of juche, which is roughly translated into self-reliance. This was not just economic self-reliance, but a self-reliance that included deep studying of Korean culture and history to guide the ideas that would bring about the development of the DPRK. In a speech given in 1955, Kim said, "What is Juche in our party's ideological work? What are we doing? We are not engaged in any other country's revolution, but precisely in the Korean Revolution. This, the Korean Revolution, constitutes juche in the ideological work of our party. Therefore, all ideological work must be subordinated to the interests of the Korean Revolution. When we study the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the history of the Chinese Revolution, or the universal truth of Marxism-Leninism, it is all for the purpose of correctly carrying out our own revolution." But Kim Il sung and the idea of juche clashed with a lot of other communists in the Workers' Party of Korea. The country's economic plan put a very high emphasis on developing heavy industry and the rebuilding of the Korean military. But the DPRK was still not fully self-reliant. For the first few years after the war, the USSR and China gave a lot of aid, money, and blueprints for factories to the DPRK to help them in their development. While Kim Il sung and the party was thankful, the supporters of Juche were also wary that if Korea could not become self-reliant, then it would always be relying on the help of stronger countries, especially if those countries were also its allies. Soviet Koreans admired the Soviet Union, and Kim recalls in the early days after the war being annoyed that in government buildings and in factories, paintings and images of Russian mountains and landscapes or Russian posters of economic plans or of factories were being hung up instead of Korean ones. Furthermore, he very strongly criticized Korean communists who sought to apply Soviet policy one-to-one in the DPRK. In the same 1955 speech, he says, "Many comrades swallow Marxism-Leninism whole instead of digesting and assimilating it. Does our people's power have exactly the same form as in other socialist countries? No, it does not. Both in revolutionary struggle and in construction work, we should firmly adhere to Marxist-Leninist principles, applying them in a creative manner to suit the specific conditions of our country and our national characteristics." The Juche idea was becoming more and more popular in the party, but many events happening in the following years really cemented it as the core ideology of the party and raised the idea of what self-reliance means to new extremes. It should be said that during the entirety of the Cold War, the DPRK was considered a puppet state of the Soviet Union. In South Korea, during the 50s and 60s, a popular story being told is that Kim Il sung had actually died back in the Second World War, and that the person leading the government was actually a Russian who was pretending to be this famous guerrilla fighter to be able to infiltrate the party. But the idea that the DPRK was ever just a Soviet puppet state completely falls apart when you look at it any closer. North Korea received a lot of help from the USSR, but it was always very critical of the USSR, and in 1956, a faction of Soviet Koreans in the party tried to do a coup d'etat in the DPRK to bring the country closer to the Soviet Union. And this attempt partly failed because the Korean people in the North as a whole were genuinely more attracted to the idea of a self reliant, independent Korea. Then, in the 50s and 60s, the DPRK began to have even more problems with China and the USSR, problems that would eventually lead to the economic downturn that allowed South Korea to overtake them in economic growth. During the Sino-Soviet split, the DPRK criticized the USSR's policy of peaceful coexistence and took the side of China. The USSR, which had provided the investments needed for huge parts of the economic plans, completely withdrew all military and technical aid, which resulted in the DPRK needing to direct more of its money into its military and less into the economy. In 1959, the military spending of the DPRK was 3%, but after the withdrawal of Soviet aid, 30% of the national budget was dedicated solely to the military. And just a few years after the Sino-Soviet split, the Cultural Revolution took place in China, leading the Red Guards to criticize Kim Il-sung for his form of leadership and criticize the DPRK for not sending troops to fight in Vietnam. Both countries withdrew their ambassadors, and a border dispute broke out between the two countries. These two incidents really cemented how fragile the DPRK was when it came to its reliance on Soviet and Chinese aid, and although relations between the three countries normalized in the 70s, they never got back to how they were during the early 50s. And to put this into perspective, from 1946 to 1978, all the foreign assistance North Korea received from the USSR and China that led to this growth in the economy totaled to around $3 billion in investment. South Korea, on the other hand, got over $15 billion to grow its economy and would not only continue to receive billions over the following decades, but was integrating into two already giant economies, that of the US and Japan. Kim Il sung was one of many different communists who became involved in the Workers' Party of Korea after the liberation from Japan, and after the war, the lines within the party were generally divided between further developing Korea's independence, represented by Kim Il sung and his idea of Juche, and Koreans that wanted to more closely follow the model of either the Soviet Union or China. And that's just a generalization. There were other lines within the party too. Before the coup, Juche was a genuinely popular idea in Korea, and Kim's clout as a war hero that had fought the Japanese since he was basically a teenager made many Koreans identify Kim as the embodiment of Korean independence, an association that Kim welcomed and would later help grow. I also want to say that while purges did happen in the party, the Workers' Party of Korea had around 12% of its population being a member of the party, a ratio of population membership that was higher than both the USSR and China, and this was before Kim reached the power he would later come to have. It was after this failed attempt, as well as the past decade that had raised the living standards of Koreans, provided many of them with education in their own language or on their own history for the very first time, much of which was a result of policy that Kim himself was very involved in the creation of, that Kim Il sung himself became the embodiment of the idea of Korean independence. Kim Il sung welcomed this comparison, and by the time the 1972 constitution of the DPRK was written, the preamble was filled with statements that solidify this relation, not just to Juche or just to Marxism Leninism, but to Kim. Statements like the great leader comrade Kim Il-sung is the son of the nation and the lodestar of the reunification of the fatherland became more popular, and by the 70s, his line was the main line of the party. A very interesting look into how Kim Il sung thought about the implementation of his idea can be found in the writings on the education policy of the DPRK. Kim's writing take a closer look at the socialist aspect of this education, the ideological component of which would hopefully form a good, morally motivated person, and that this morality would lead to being a supporter of the party. This idea is not at all unique to Kim Il sung. The idea of a new Soviet man is very similar. The idea that in the Soviet Union, the socialist society would foster the development of people that are selfless, physically healthy, and politically conscious. Che Guevara also took time to write about this idea as well, and during his time in Cuba after the revolution, repeatedly emphasized the need for the people to not only be driven by economic incentives, but by moral ones, and that the government should take it on as a responsibility to instill this sense of community and morality in the Cuban people. In Kim Il sung's thesis on socialist education, Kim writes, collectivism is the basis of social life under socialism and communism, and a principle that guides the actions of communists. We should educate all these students to outgrow individualism and selfishness and to work, study, and live according to the collectivist principle of one for all and all for one, and fight with devotion for society and the people, for the interests of the party and the revolution. All students should be taught to regard work as honorable and sacred, to enjoy work, to observe labor discipline willingly, and to participate conscientiously in any common endeavor for the good of the collective and society. In North Korean education, a heavy emphasis is placed on the anti-Japanese resistance and on raising class consciousness in the population, and that these common perspectives on their place in history would foster people with a strong sense of morality and support for Juche, which would then in turn lead to loyalty to the party who is in charge of implementing that idea. Now, we can criticize this as much as we want. I have plenty of my own criticisms, and words that are frequently thrown at the DPRK government and at Kim, like hierarchical and authoritarian, have a place in that discussion. But I don't want you to come out of this video thinking that Kim was just a power-hungry guy that did everything for the sake of power, or that modern North Korea was always Kim Il-sung's goal. There were many things that could have happened throughout the DPRK's history that would have radically changed the way the country functioned, his role in the government, and the development of Juche. The DPRK, Juche, and Kim Il-sung himself constantly changed and radicalized because there was no point in this country's history where it could put its own development above its need to create a strong and hard state, even when its own development was being hurt by the need to have that strong and hard state. There are obvious criticisms to be made of the DPRK and of its founder, but I find that talking about these criticisms without putting any thought into the context that guided their decisions defeats the point. Before coming back to the economic development, I should probably also spend time talking about how the government of the DPRK functions. The Supreme People's Assembly is the highest organ of state power in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It has 687 seats, one representative from each of the constituencies decided in local elections, and these representatives convene once or twice a year for multiple days where they have the power to pass or to repeal laws, change the constitution, approve a new state budget, ratify treaties, and most importantly, they have the power to appoint or to recall the three most powerful political positions in North Korea. These three positions have different powers when the Supreme People's Assembly is not currently meeting, which is the vast majority of the year. The premier of the cabinet is currently held by Pak Tae-sung, whose responsibilities are the actual implementation of state policies, the state budget, the national banking system, and the plan for the economy. According to North Korea's constitution, the premier of the cabinet represents the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The president of the Presidium of the Supreme People's Assembly is today held by Cho Ryong-hae, who is in charge of convening the Supreme People's Assembly electing judges to the Central Court, interpreting the Constitution and its laws, and most importantly, has the power to rescind the decisions made by the chairman of the State Affairs Commission. Speaking of which, the chairman of the State Affairs Commission is today held by Kim Jong-un, which means that he is the head of the military, decides state policy, and signs treaties with foreign countries. Now, all the power that today rests with these three positions used to be concentrated in one position, the premier of the DPRK, which was held by Kim Il-sung. But when Kim Il-sung died, the government decided to split this position into three, which are now elected and subject to recall by the Supreme People's Assembly. If I had to find something analogous to these positions in the US, I guess Kim Jong-un holds the position of Commander-in-Chief, which in the US is Donald Trump. Cho Ryong-hae has the highest legislative powers, which in the US is technically all of Congress, although J.D. Vance has the power to break any ties and was picked by Donald Trump, who also has the power to veto any laws passed by Congress. And then ultimately Pak Tae-sung is the head of the executive, in charge of how the actual implementation of the laws passed will happen, which in the US is also a position held by Donald Trump. Now, the Supreme People's Assembly is majority dominated by seats that belong to the Workers' Party of Korea, headed also by Kim Jong-un, although the WPK does still rule in a coalition with the Korean Social Democratic Party and the Chondoist Chongdu Party. The Workers' Party of Korea has over 6 million members that are actively engaged in the party's politics. The party goes through purges of its membership every few years, and there are elections within the party for different peoples in its structures. The truth is, we only know so much about how the WPK and the DPRK works because of their isolationism. But back in the 50s and 60s, when there were more internal factions in the party and attempted coups, the US was already speaking about North Korea as a dictatorship that was completely ruled by one person. There are local elections in Korea that choose delegates in the Supreme People's Assembly, and more than 20% of the population is actively involved in the country's ruling party. The DPRK is a dictatorship of the ruling coalition between three parties, the largest of whom is the WPK, the party that claims it is the representative of the class interests of the people of North Korea, and that because of this shared interest between the party and the people, they are remaining in power. You can laugh at that and call bullshit all you want to, but quoting analysis published on the New York Times of all outlets, it is striking in speaking to the defectors that for all the horrors they portray, they do not contend that North Korea is seething with discontent. On the contrary, many suggest that ordinary North Koreans have faith in their leaders.
거기는 독재라고 말하잖아요. 프롤레타리아 독재라고, 인민 독재라고. 당장하게 바뀌잖아요. 헌법이 그렇게 그 사람들 법이 그렇게 됐다고. 프롤레타리아 독재 국가예요. 프롤레타리아라는 게 우리 말하면 그저 무산자들이 독재라는 소리예요. 인민들이 뭐 지금 어떤 발전된 인민 독재라고 해도 되지. 인민들이 한 독재, 자본가나 소수 이런 권력 부의 독점자들이 거기면서 배견할 수 없다고 말이지. 그런 당이에요. 원래 조선노동당이에요.
And this faith is no doubt inspired, at least in part, by the fact that the government has been able to publicly acknowledge mistakes made and quickly pivot to new solutions. In the 1970s, when South Korea had overtaken the North's economic growth, the government had to reanalyze what was being invested in. Kim Il-sung's original position that only focusing on heavy industry was criticized, and so the government diversified the sectors in which money was being invested in, with an increase in attention put into textiles, technology, and food production. The DPRK also realized that it didn't want to just rely on the USSR, and so actually sought to establish some ties with European countries in the 1970s as well, and bought technology and other equipment on credit with the hopes of modernizing their industry and paying back the credit with the profits made from said exports. But in the mid-1970s, the economy went into a recession, and unable to make the profits they had expected, the DPRK was unable to pay back its loans. The IMF approached the DPRK with the same deal they would make to South Korea 2 decades later. We will give you the money to pay back your debt, but you have to adjust the economic structure of your country. Unlike the Republic of Korea, the DPRK rejected this deal, and the consequence of this was basically an international blacklist from Western banking institutions. The DPRK did try to avoid this from happening. They offered to trade goods in place of the money that was being asked for them. They asked for the debts to be frozen so they could pay them back at a later date, or to establish a longer time period to pay them back. But all of these requests were rejected, with the only way to pay back its debts were with money it did not have. And so, after a brief attempt to open up its government to the rest of the world, the DPRK found itself permanently locked out of that system. Another way the DPRK government has tried to change its economy was by introducing a special economic zone, a part of the country with looser laws restricting how businesses are allowed to operate and lower taxes, designed to attract foreign investment. However, this attempt at experimenting has also proven to not be as effective as hoped, only being able to attract around 130 to 150 million in investment. Because the US has sanctions against the DPRK, it is illegal for American businesses to invest in North Korea, despite American companies like Motorola, General Motors, AT&T, and Citibank being interested in doing so. But because these sanctions are worded as loosely as possible, there are also secondary sanctions against other companies from around the world that prevent them from investing in the DPRK if they also operate within the US, restricting the amount of companies that can invest in North Korea down to those from countries that are already separate from the US-led economy, mainly Russia and China. That being said, with the renormalization of relations with China and the USSR in the 70s, the DPRK was able to reach some level of stability for the following decades. They would never again reach the levels of growth in the first 25 years of its existence, but with the trade between countries of the Eastern Bloc, the DPRK could maintain a relatively stable existence. That is, until the 90s. The DPRK suffers from some of the strictest sanctions placed on any country, and it severely impacts its ability to export the technology, food, and clothes it produces to other countries. Without the ability to export anything, it also doesn't really have the ability to accumulate any foreign currency, and the little that it does have is mostly reinvested into its military. With the countries of the Eastern Bloc, the DPRK was able to barter directly, trading exports for goods from the countries of Eastern Europe and China. But when most of those countries collapsed, the DPRK lost access to more than half of the countries it was trading with, and, quoting Martin Hart-Landsberg, with minimal hard currency reserves, the North was forced to sharply cut its imports. Overall trade between North Korea and the countries of the former Soviet bloc, including the Soviet Union, fell by approximately 67% in 1991. The repercussions have been severe. According to US and South Korean intelligence estimates, North Korea's GNP grew 2% in 1989 and then declined in each of the next 6 years, by 3.7% in 1990, 5.2% in 1991, 7.6% in 1992, 4.3% in 1993, 1.7% in 1994, and a further 4.6% in 1995. And then, when the North Korean economy was already in the worst position it had ever been, North Korea was hit by a flood in 1995 that viewers described as being one of biblical proportions. It was, without exaggeration, the worst flood that the world had seen in over 70 years. It was estimated that in 72 hours alone, 4.8 billion tons of rain fell. It completely destroyed much of North Korean agriculture and food reserves, and it wiped out more than 80% of the power generators in the country. The country appealed for international aid, and it begged for the sanctions against it to be lifted so it could export its products to other countries get foreign currency, and then use that foreign currency to buy food and materials to fix what had just been destroyed. But only the sanctions relating to humanitarian aid were lifted. Most of the ones affecting the rest of the economy were kept in place. And the US did help North Korea out, but only after it was seriously debated on starving them out. And even when this aid did eventually come from the US, it wasn't for free. Between 1995 and 2008, the US gave North Korea some 1.8 billion in assistance during this crisis, half of which was in the form of food and the other half of which was given in the form of energy assistance. This second aid was only given in exchange for the freezing of North Korea's plutonium-related nuclear facilities. In other words, this wasn't aid just given out for free, but the US used the desperate position of North Korea to force domestic changes in exchange for relief. And if we compare this 1.3 billion in aid given to North Korea over the period of 13 years and compare that to some of the other things the US spends its money on, like, for example, $18 billion of military aid to the Israeli army in the year 2024 alone, or around 3 to 5 billion every year to keep its military bases in South Korea running, we can see that 1.3 billion over a period of 13 years is not actually that much at all. The DPRK did receive a lot of aid from South Korea and from other countries around the world, but the mid-90s and early 2000s was arguably the worst period in the history of the DPRK since the Korean War, and hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless, and more than 1 million people died from malnutrition, the flood, or communicable diseases like tuberculosis and malaria in this period. Something that everyone in the West seems to be terrified about is the nuclear threat posed by North Korea. But we should always remember the story of how nukes were brought onto the Korean peninsula in the first place. It was President Dwight D. Eisenhower and General MacArthur of the UN forces that threatened North Korea with a nuclear attack. Threats that forced North Korea to accept that tens of thousands of prisoners of war would not be returned back home, and threats that caused an estimated 10 million people to flee the north, permanently separating families after the ceasefire. Then, in the 70s, Park Chung-hee's government began to develop their own nuclear weapons, but was stopped only due to the US pressure that exchanged the development of nuclear weapons for increased US military presence in the South. Then, when Reagan became president in the 80s, he revised a US military doctrine that allowed for a first nuclear attack against the North if war was ever to break out again. It was only after each of these escalations in rhetoric that North Korea began to develop nuclear weapons, and even during this process, there were many chances given for them to stop. For example, in the early 90s, the DPRK had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and agreed to 6 separate inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency, all of which found nothing out of the ordinary with what the DPRK had reported. North Korea had wanted, in exchange for signing the treaty and accepting inspections, that the US would withdraw its right of a first nuclear strike. But not only did the US refuse to withdraw the policy, but they also said they wanted to re-inspect the DPRK again, and directly accused them of already having manufactured a bomb. In response, the DPRK withdrew from the treaty, and the US responded with not only increased sanctions, but by beginning to incorporate the simulated nuclear destruction of the North during their annual war games held on the border of South Korea, something that still happens almost every year. In addition, in recent years both South Korean and American politicians have directly threatened North Korea with the total destruction of its territory. In April 1994, U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry said that he would not rule out a first nuclear strike on North Korea, but that he preferred considerable pressure on the North that would increase the risk of a northern response. In 1995, Colin Powell stated that the U.S. would turn North Korea into a charcoal briquette, a threat he repeated on numerous occasions. In 2017, Donald Trump told the world that under him, North Korea would be met with fire and fury that the world has never seen. Since the early 2000s until today, North Korea has continued to develop its nuclear weapons programs and today possesses several nuclear warheads. But why does North Korea have nuclear weapons, and why do they refuse to give them up? We often hear about the North Korean nuclear threat in the media, and of course, it is always threatening when a country you are at war with is in possession of a weapon like a nuclear bomb. But we often forget that just like we are in this situation, so is North Korea. And it has been in this situation for much longer under the direct threat of a nuclear bomb for decades before it had even developed these weapons. In the Korean War, the only reason that the bomb wasn't dropped was because the Soviets had also developed their own atomic bomb, and the US feared that there might be consequences. I think the reality we're all living under, where numerous countries have a nuclear bomb in their position, is terrifying. But what I would argue is more terrifying is if only one country had a nuclear bomb. And like the US had shown during the end of the Second World War, it had no problem dropping it and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. In a rare interview with a DPRK official, Yong Hao Tae was asked about the DPRK's nuclear weapons, and he responded by referring to the case of Gaddafi. In 2003, Gaddafi agreed to give up Libya's nuclear weapons in exchange for the normalization of relations with the West and to attract investment into Libya. Not even 10 years later, NATO forces helped overthrow his government, and a video was recorded for the entire world to see how the military that NATO supported had captured and beat Gaddafi half to death, raping him on camera before executing him. What lesson is any country that wants to survive supposed to take from this? It is actually a good thing that the US and Europe feel threatened by other countries, because if they didn't, then they would be even more open about their violence and more willing to use it freely. And for all the talk that we constantly hear on the media about the irrational North Korean government, North Korea's foreign policy positions seem to be pretty stable over the last 70 years of its existence. The same fear is not extended to countries like Israel, for example, which have shown to be much more violent and much more erratic than North Korea has ever been. So, if North Korea isn't this big, bad, evil country that just does everything because it is evil, then what is it actually like? Researching about North Korea is hard. It's true that it is an extremely closed off country, but the US and European media have taken this isolation as a blank check to just basically write whatever they want to about the country, and as long as it's negative, it'll get published. Several US journalists have said this themselves. In an article on foreign policy, American journalist Isaac Stone Fish wrote, "As an American journalist, you can write almost anything you want about North Korea and people will believe it." Later in the same article, he talked about how he wrote and published an article about a growing drug epidemic in North Korea that he knew he didn't have any evidence for that turned out to be completely false. The British newspaper The Telegraph published an article saying that when it comes to writing about North Korea, the rulebook gets thrown out the window, and a study published in the International Journal of Communication Ethics identified the approach to reporting on North Korea is at a standard that would not be accepted for any other country. And this situation is not at all helped by the fact that the United States directly funds several websites and organizations that are dedicated to spreading as much negative and over-exaggerated news about North Korea as possible, and that the South Korean government, a country where, again, advocating for reunification with the North or praising it in any way can send you to prison, also directly funds several of these organizations that more often than not just end up citing each other. Radio Free Asia, directly created by the CIA and funded by US Congress during the Cold War to spread misinformation about North Korea and China. NK News, funded by the US Department of War and operates out of South Korea. Daily NK, funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by the US Congress. The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, funded by the US State Department, and is also run by a former employee of Radio Free Asia. Now, we should not forget that the US and South Korea have a very hostile relationship with the North, and information about one country that comes directly from the government of the other is not a good source. For example, you would never write about the Ukraine war relying solely on information produced by the Russian government, nor would you write about Palestine based on information solely from the Israeli government. Yet, in the case of North Korea, any standards of critical journalism is completely excused, and any academic standards are almost completely loosened. And then these completely unreliable sources will themselves get cited in more legitimate human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Both of these are organizations that do good work. But actually read the reports they put out on North Korea, and more often than not, they will directly cite one of these US-funded organizations as proof of what they're claiming. And once US-funded news organizations have reported on a story, more respectable organizations launder the information, and it enters the public consciousness, and basically any horrible thing written about the country can be believed. And this complete lack of any standards applied to reporting on North Korea is also then applied to actions taken against North Korea. For example, in 2019, the United States sent a team of Navy SEALs to invade North Korea and plant listening devices, but upon entering the country, were accidentally discovered by a boat of Korean fishermen. In response, the SEALs killed everyone on the boat, stabbed the bodies to make them sink, and then disappeared into the sea. If this had happened in any other country where civilians were randomly killed by invading forces, it would be all over the news. And yet, when the US kills North Korean civilians, it's just mentioned a few times in some articles that end up justifying the attacks. Another prime example of this dehumanization happening is with the movie The Interview. The Interview tells the funny comedic story about the serial sex offender James Franco and his friend Seth Rogen going to interview Kim Jong-un and then assassinate him. And when I watched it for the first time at the age of 14 or 15, I thought it was the funniest thing ever. Little did I know that what I was watching was directly encouraged by the US government. In 2014, Sony Pictures was hacked, and a bunch of private documents and emails were leaked that revealed extensive connections to the US State Department, including instructions from people in the government about the death scene of Kim Jong-un and how graphic it should be. And Seth Rogen has gone on to admit that there were government advisors working on the film that he suspected worked for the CIA. People like Bruce Bennett, a defense analyst at the RAND Corporation, a think tank for the US military, were brought in as a consultant on the movie, and while talking about the project, stated, "This film's in terms of the South Korean market, as well as its infiltration by defector balloon-dropping organizations into North Korea, could possibly get the wheels of a kind of regime change plot into motion." And if any articles or reports about North Korea even bother to cite any information at all, it is almost 100% always going to be a North Korean defector. But these defector testimonies have a very bad habit of falling apart upon closer inspection. For example, as someone who has worked in documentary filmmaking, it's usually a pretty common rule that you are not supposed to pay your subjects for their participation in a film. And it's also quite widely considered to be journalistic malpractice to pay a source for information. As soon as you have given someone money to do something, they will feel pressured to do that thing for you, even if that thing is lying. This is made all the easier by the fact that North Koreans coming to the South don't have any access to money, sometimes don't have family, aren't used to life in a different economic system, and are widely discriminated against in South Korean society. North Koreans have been rejected by landlords, by employers, and their children rejected by public school based on where they were born. In the most extreme cases, defectors have even become homeless or starved to death after being completely rejected by South Korean society. So for people coming into this situation, the offer of being paid hundreds to thousands of dollars for exaggerating or lying can be a very easy trap to fall into. The South Korean Ministry of Unification pays an hourly wage to defectors for their stories of life in North Korea, but this wage is paid on a sliding scale based on the information they provide. A weekly South Korean show called Now on My Way to See You, which tells the stories of defectors to a South Korean audience, pays defectors the equivalent of $2,000 for 2 days of shooting, and defector turned celebrity Yeonmi Park was paid more than 12,000 US dollars per speech she gave while touring the US. With an incentive to tell more shocking stories in exchange for money to survive, it leads to more and more exaggerated stories that are repeated in the press, full well knowing that it was information given in exchange for money, which for any other subject matter crosses a very big ethical boundary. For example, defector Shin Dong-hyuk published a famous book detailing his life story and escape from a prison camp in North Korea, and he gave his testimony in the UN, which directly led to increased sanctions against the North. But years after the book was published, the book's ghostwriter Blaine Hardin admitted that Shin had knowingly not been telling the truth when retelling his life story, and South Korean intelligence determined that he had never actually been imprisoned in any camp at all. Defector Lee Soon-ok claimed to have been imprisoned in North Korea where she was tortured with molten iron, but the head of an association of North Korean defectors in the South, Chang In-suk, said that he personally knew Lee while in North Korea and he knew it for a fact that she had never been imprisoned at all. David Yun, a Korean-American filmmaker, has told the story of a North Korean defector friend of his who got a call from the aforementioned Now on My Way to See You TV show to give his testimony. And when he told them that his experience of North Korea was not reflected on the show at all, he was told by the show's producers, "Sir, you can't say that kind of stuff. Don't worry, we will give you a script. All you have to do is read it out loud." The absolute worst of these defectors is undoubtedly Yeonmi Park, who has claimed, and no, these are not jokes, that North Koreans don't know about the existence of the internet or the continent of Africa, that in North Korea there is no word for love, that she and her mother escaped from North Korea and trekked through the Gobi Desert in minus 40-degree weather with no winter clothes, that a normal street in North Korea has a mound of human corpses, that rats roam the streets of the north, and that Korean kids eat the rats, and then the rats will in turn eat the kids back, and that Kim Jong-un is simultaneously secretly gay, but is also in the possession of numerous women sex slaves. All of these stories have been debunked by none other than her own mother, who said in an interview, "We were not to that extent. We were never in a position where we were starving." She claimed her daughter didn't know anything about any serious hardship in North Korea until she left the country, stating, "Her father did his best to give his kids a better life." But I'd like to move on from this section by quoting a different North Korean defector, Lee Ji-son, in relation to these stories. "No one would believe this unless they were an idiot."
And you see children like chasing the rats, eating just rats, eating human eyes first, and then children catch these rats and they eat and they somehow die from I don't know what it is. Then rats eat the children back. So this cycle of us eating rats and they eat us back is going to continue and continue.
Yeah, and you said that was happening in the hospital.
But then, of course, not even these stories are enough for South Korea, seemingly, as the South Korean government has been caught on more than one occasion kidnapping North Koreans and shipping them to the South and then stripping them of their passports. In 2016, it was widely reported that 13 North Koreans who had been living in Indonesia had defected to South Korea. However, 2 years later, it came out that all 13 of these North Koreans, 12 workers and their boss, alleged that while working in Indonesia, South Korean intelligence services approached them at a restaurant they worked at and threatened them, ultimately kidnapping them to the South, and despite all 13 of them asking to go back and refusing to live in South Korea, the South Korean government has not returned them. I'll also play a clip now from the documentary Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang in Seoul that interviews one of these kidnapped defectors that wants to return home but can't.
오자마자 저는 국정원 덕방에 갇히게 됩니다. 그래서 국정원 사람들한테 나는 이 브로커한테 속아서 잘못한 사람이다. 난 내 고향에 가야 된다. 이 남쪽에서 살 이유가 없다 하고 계속 하소연하죠. 그러다가 덧방에 있으면서 한 달 동안을 제가 단식 투쟁을 합니다. 밥을 안 먹고 막 난 빨리 보내달라 하지만 끝내 이 사람들은 저를 보내주지 않아요. 보내주지 않고 한 3개월 정도 가다 놨다가 대한민국 국민으로 살겠다는 서약서 한 장만 써라. 너 이거 안 쓰면 죽을 때까지 여기서 나갈 수가 없다. 설사 내가 국정원에서 죽는다고 해도 그걸 알 수 있는 사람은 세상에 단 한 명도 없을 것이다. 써주게 됐던 원인이 다른 데서 들으니까 탈북자들이 남쪽에 오게 되면 이제 국정원을 나가게 되면 사회에 나가서 6개월만 있으면 대한민국 여권이 발급됐다고 합니다. 여권을 받으면 뭐 중국이든 어디든 마음대로 갈 수가 있겠죠. 그래서 그 여권을 받아서 나는 중국으로 해서 다시 내 고향에 돌아가야 되겠다. 그게 유일한 방법이었어요. 국정원에서 저를 안 보내주니까 이제는 여권 받아서 멀리 가는 방법밖에 없겠구나. 그래서 그때 서약서를 쓸 때 그 심정이었죠. 내가 살아서 내 엄마 아빠 내 딸한테 다시 돌아갈 수만 있으면 그 서약서 100장 1000장이라도 써주면 내가 써줄 수 있겠다. 살아서만 갈 수 있으면. 그래서 써주게 됐던 거죠. 그래서 밖에 나와가지고 6개월을 기다립니다. 그 여권만 나오기를. 6개월 된 다음에 구청에다가 여권을 신청을 해요. 여권이 안 나와요. 왜지? 하고 한 1년 정도 다시 기다리고 또 신청을 합니다. 했는데 여권이 안 나와요. 또. 그래서 왜 그러냐고 물어보니까 국정원에서 돌아오는 대답이 당신은 처음부터 북으로 돌아가겠다고 했기 때문에 여권을 해주면 나중에라도 북으로 도망갈까봐 여기 있는 한 절대로 여권이 발급될 수 없다. 이런 대답이 들어와요. 그때 저는 참 막막하고 하늘이 무너졌고 이 지구상에 세상에 이런 게 존재할 수 있구나. 해외에 있는 자기 나라 국민이 아닌 해외에 있는 사람을 남의 사람을 이렇게 유인해서 납치해다가는 덕방에 가두고 강제로 서약서를 받아내고 강제로 자기 나라 국적을 지어주고는 나중에라도 북으로 자기 고향 가족한테 도망갈까봐 이 7년 세월을 여권을 안 해주는 이런 세상이 정말 존재하는구나. 이게 너무 슬프고 힘들고 이거 사람 사는 세상인데 이 사람들도 인간이고 가족이 있는데 나를 바라보면서 미안하지 않을까. 어떻게 하루아침에 엄마한테서 딸을 빼앗고 딸에게서 엄마의 사랑을 빼앗는 이런 천체도 하지 못할 잔인한 짓을 하면서도 정말 미안하지 않을까. 이런 생각으로 너무 힘들었죠.
From how often you hear about North Koreans as these survivors that escaped literal concentration camps, defectors that tell their story to the media actually make up a super small percentage of overall North Koreans that defect. The majority of defectors, and I do mean the vast majority, don't tell any horror stories about their time in the North at all. For example, Christopher Green, head of Korea work at the International Crisis Group, whose job it is talking to North Korean defectors, said in an interview that the primary reason North Koreans defect was for reuniting with their families, economic reasons, or wanting their kids to have better access to education, and that the portrayal of defectors defecting solely because of mistreatment or for political reasons is dishonest. And yet, for information about how life in North Korea is, these people are completely ignored. Now that we've talked a lot about how stories about North Korea are created, I'm going to take a very quick look at 9 stories we've all probably heard about North Korea. 1. This photo of the Korean peninsula from space. You have undoubtedly seen this picture online of North Korea compared to South Korea, depicting the North as a place with absolutely no light and no electricity. Would you be surprised if I told you that this picture is fake? I'll play a video of Professor Susie Kim explaining how this image is constructed.
Well, NASA, the image has been captured by satellites from NASA, and it's captured in a nighttime view of the Korean Peninsula. But if you look at the explanation from NASA about how this image is captured, it basically talks about the need to adjust for not only daylight, but city lights, gas flares, wildfires, or reflected moonlight. In other words, other kinds of light that can get in the way of capturing this needs to be filtered out. And what's helpful about looking at this particular image is that you see the the part marked with the box. And with the kind of light that it has there, you might assume, compared to other places like Japan or South Korea or China, that it's another landmass. But it's actually not a landmass. It's actually lights from fishing boats in the Yellow Sea. And so if you don't account for that, then you can see how you can expect that the image could be very well distorted. So what I do then, after I explain to the students about how these images were created, I show students this image. And I ask them, can they guess where this is? And it takes most students a couple of minutes, but they usually figure out that it's the continental United States. And the image, it's obviously much more sort of sporadic, but the image is based on a similar kind of low light imaging of the Earth at night, and it's controlled for the same kind of, sunlight, gas flares, and that sort of thing.
NASA has also published an updated, better quality of the same situation that now includes the disclaimer at the bottom of the article that the image is enhanced to improve contrast. Now, this isn't to say that North Korea doesn't suffer from electricity shortages. They absolutely do, and these shortages lead to rationing of electricity. But this isn't anything unique to North Korea. Countries all across Asia, Latin America, and Africa suffer from electricity shortages and ration them as well. The fact that a poor country that is sanctioned by the rest of the world suffers from electricity shortages is only really a surprising thing to you if your only experience of the world is growing up in a rich Western country. 2. Everyone in North Korea is poor, hungry, and a prisoner. A lot of defectors coming out have a lot of stories about growing up destitute, eating grass, with no access to hospitals or public services. While I have no doubt that those of them who lived through the famine of the late 90s genuinely experienced these horrible things, the general perspective on North Korea seems to be frozen in time, and the experiences of this decade are made to be representative of everything that came before and after it. For example, historian of Korean history Bruce Cummings found a CIA report from 1999 that, according to him, almost begrudgingly acknowledged various achievements of this regime: compassionate care for children in general and war orphans in particular, radical change in the position of women, genuinely free housing, free healthcare, and preventative medicine, and infant mortality and life expectancy rates comparable to those of the most advanced countries until the recent famine. And in the years after the famine, these conditions have returned. In 2013, a study done by South Korea found that although the DPRK had a higher mortality rate than China or South Korea, its mortality rate was significantly lower than the average for Asia as a whole, with similar trends for the infant mortality rates, malnutrition rates, and life expectancy, all slightly lower than the global average, but significantly higher than the average for low-income countries. As for schooling and housing, both of these are guaranteed by the state. And although we can compare the quality of these things to what we have in the West, a fairer comparison would be to the average housing and schools for people in other low-income countries like Rwanda, Peru, Bolivia, and Zambia. As for North Korea being a police state where everyone goes to jail for any little thing, this can also be disproven by just looking at some data and comparing. For example, the absolute highest number of prisoners given for North Korea based on defector testimony is 120,000 people. So if we take the absolute highest estimate given, the incarceration rate in North Korea is 0.5% of the population. But let's take a look at the US, for example, where more than 2 million people are incarcerated, making up 0.7% of the population, a higher percentage of citizens in prison. And that doesn't include the prisons and black sites that the US has set up all over the world, nor does it adjust for the fact that 1 in 3 black men will statistically end up in prison in the US, nor does it account for those disappeared by ICE, or the thousands of migrants that are kept in cages along the border. I mean, if we're looking at statistics, then you're significantly more likely to be sent to prison in the US if you are a brown or black man than if you were a Korean man in North Korea. That isn't to say that North Korean prisons are a nice place to be, or that I personally think everybody in those prisons deserves to be there. but every single criticism of these prisons can just as easily be applied multiple times over to the US. US prisons are also filled with innocent people, people who are victims of violent treatment at the hands of guards inside of them, forced to perform unpaid and dangerous labor, and are kept in dehumanizing conditions. Living conditions in North Korea aren't anything crazy out of the ordinary. It's not a paradise with no problems, and it's not the literal hell on earth that Western media makes it out to be. In fact, I reckon that it's quite a normal and boring day-to-day experience for North Koreans compared to other countries with similar income. 3. The DPRK publicly executes people for watching Squid Game. In February of 2026, it was alleged by Amnesty International that the North Korean government had publicly executed school children for watching Squid Game and other South Korean TV shows. The article is entirely made up of 3 sources, mostly anonymous defectors who claim to have seen these things happening, the other referring to some law that exists in North Korea where anyone who watches South Korean content is sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, a law that, when you look it up in Google, only the Daily NK has written about it. And thirdly, the article also mentions Radio Free Asia directly as further proof of public executions. But even if we ignore the sources, other things we do know for a fact about North Korea contradict these claims. In 2016, a US citizen was caught in the DPRK on the behalf of South Korean intelligence agencies stealing state secrets, including information relating to military and nuclear programs. But this guy, who was, again, a US citizen, only got a 10-year sentence for espionage. So we're expected to believe that people working on behalf of a government that North Korea is currently at war with, stealing state secrets, will get a 10-year sentence, but a child watching Squid Game will get publicly executed in front of his classmates. Squid Game, by the way, has been talked about publicly on one of North Korea's state-run media websites that is there for North Koreans to read. The website Arirang Mary quotes Squid Game as reflecting South Korea's beastly society. So at the very least, North Koreans know about Squid Game and what happens in this show through their government, yet school children are publicly executed for watching it. Now, outside of just this incident, it is also quite frequently claimed by Western sources that specific people all over North Korea are being killed for no reason, from members of the military like Kim Yong-chol and Ri Yong-gil, to local celebrities like Hyung Sung-wol, to even members of Kim's own family like Kim Kyung-hui. The Western press reported they had proof that these people were executed for some minor infraction, only for them to be found later completely fine. Every single time there is an international sporting event, people ogle at North Koreans as if they were some alien race, and the comments are filled with people claiming, oh, they have to win because if they don't, their family will be executed. Claims that are completely made up and have no basis in reality. Claiming that school children are publicly executed for doing things that school children do, or that this or that general was killed for slouching. It's good for getting lots of clicks, but when you actually read the text, look at what they're sourcing, and cross-reference some of the stories told in these articles to other things we do know about North Korea, they very rarely hold up to scrutiny. 4. The DPRK forces everyone to get a Kim Jong-un haircut. In 2014, Radio Free Asia reported that North Korean university students had been ordered to get the same haircut as Kim Jong-un. This article mentions some anonymous unnamed sources that claimed that they had heard that this was the case, and the media, from BBC to Australia's main broadcasting network to late-night comedians, uncritically reported this story to millions of people, citing this report by the American government that claimed some vague unnamed source. But surprise, it turned out to be completely false. This was not a misinterpretation of something real. This was either something that Radio Free Asia intentionally published knowing it was a lie, or found a couple of defectors and paid them thousands to make up a story, and then published it knowing it was a lie. There's actually a really cool short documentary about two guys that went to North Korea to get a haircut that explains a lot of the context that goes behind some of the completely made up stories we hear about all the time. 5. The DPRK discovers a unicorn. In 2012, it was reported on numerous mainstream news channels that the DPRK had discovered a unicorn layer. Word for word, this sentence was written on numerous sites, reported on in the news, made fun of on talk shows. Unsurprisingly, the claim that the DPRK had itself reported the discovery of a unicorn layer is a complete lie. The word translated to unicorn's layer in Korean is kiringul, a word that refers to a historical site in Korean history that has to do with King Tongmyong, the leader of an ancient Korean civilization. In Korean legend, King Tongmyong is known to have ridden a kirin, a mythical creature that can be translated to unicorn. So when North Korea reports that it found Kiringul, it was a name given to the historical site it found that had to do with a legend about the real person who used to live and work there. To put this into perspective, imagine some myth about a suspected gate to hell being inside of a real cave that was lost for hundreds of years, and then when some archaeologists find the real cave that was mythologized about, they name it something evoking that myth, and other countries report about that news claiming that the Americans had discovered real, literal proof of hell itself. One mistranslation of a word and a complete lack of interest in reading the actual report or of the cultural context, and a report put out about discovering a historical site of an ancient civilization can be twisted into the DPRK claiming it discovered a mythical animal. 6. DPRK phones. In 2025, it was reported that some special phones had just been snuck out of the DPRK, and that a special investigation done by the BBC has revealed just how repressive the reach of the government really is. Now, for some reason, the BBC uploaded this report in a YouTube short with no description of where the phone is from or who got it for them, which is always the sign of good journalism, but I wanted to find out how they got this phone in the first place. After some searching, I found this video from a tech YouTuber who also looks through the exact same phone shown in the BBC report, and he very openly thanks Daily NK for providing these phones to him. Daily NK, which is funded by the United States Congress, has also knowingly reported on fake executions, finding unicorns, and forced haircuts, and who the YouTuber admits all the things he's showing you are the result of Daily NK telling him what to show. But what I really want to focus on is the claim that is made in both of these videos, that in order to spy on their citizens, North Korean phones take an automatic screenshot every few minutes and save them on the phone in a locked folder that only the North Korean government can unlock. Now, for one, I just want to remind everyone that all of our phones, our technology, is compromised at all times. We are fully being spied on by our government all the time, and it's so socially accepted that we make jokes about how when we talk about things, that thing will get recommended to us as an ad later in the day. So even if this was real, the US and Europe do the exact same thing. Now, ignoring the fact that there are DPRK citizens who can just buy phones in China and Russia, the BBC actually wants you to believe that the government of North Korea is so incompetent that it cannot figure out how to install simple spyware onto phones. Spyware that any parent with access to Google can figure out how to install on their kid's phone. And so instead of spying the normal civilized way all of our government spies on us, they have to spy in this incredibly complicated way that requires your phone's data to be almost singularly devoted towards random screenshots. Are we really to believe that North Korea, the country that is known in the Western media as the most totalitarian country ever, has not figured out how to monitor phone activity? This story reads like the Daily NK wanted to publish a story about the government spying on phones, but couldn't do it in the very obvious way that our government spies on us, So they had to invent an incredibly stupid and incompetent way of doing it so that people couldn't make the association to their own lives. 7. North Koreans crying over the funeral of Kim Il-sung. We've all probably seen the videos posted online, on Reddit, on Instagram, in the news of North Koreans crying, bawling their eyes out at the death of Kim Il-sung. This outpouring of grief is almost taken as itself being proof that North Koreans are all a brainwashed mob, forced to cry for their eternal leader, because surely nobody would have any genuine feelings over the death of a brutal dictator who did nothing but torture and murder his own people, right? Oh, wait, that's my bad. I was using the wrong video file there. Those aren't North Koreans mourning the death of Kim Il-sung. Those are South Koreans mourning the death of Park Chung-hee, a brutal dictator that tortured and murdered his own people and, unlike Kim Il-sung, worked for the Japanese occupation to keep Korea as a colony of Japan. Let's actually think about this for more than 2 seconds, right? You can criticize Park and Kim all you want, but these were both political leaders who led countries during massive changes in the life of average Koreans. Under Kim, not to mention his legacy as an anti-Japanese resistance fighter, North Koreans for the first time in decades learned to read, had access to higher education systems, had stable jobs and income, homes with plumbing and electricity, and under Park, South Koreans also gained a massive raise in living standards and a growing economy. I think I've made my point on how horrible I think Park was as a human being, but how disconnected from humanity and empathy would I need to be to not at least understand why a South Korean who lived under him for 20 years would not mourn his death? And how disconnected from humanity and empathy would you need to be to not understand why North Koreans would feel genuine grief for the leader of their country? 8. DPRK citizens have no idea about the outside world. This is another one that takes a kernel of truth and then expands it so that it affects every part of their life. While it's true that citizens in the DPRK are not living in completely open societies with access to international media and travel like we do in the US and Europe, the stories told to us in the West are completely propagandized to the point of absurdity. Because first we need to ask ourselves, why are there any restrictions in the first place? Well, North Korea is a country that is, for one, almost completely internationally isolated, 2, currently at war, and 3, currently at war with a highly developed country on its border that has gone out of its way to entice people into leaving the country so as to use the difference in living standards as a tool for propaganda. And when a country is in a position where it feels constantly threatened, it begins to act in ways that it wouldn't usually. That's why a lot of South Korean, American, and European media is banned in the country. And I say a lot because not all of it is, because despite restrictions, some things are still available to watch and read.
You know that North Korea has a Netflix analog, and they use that Netflix analog not only to watch North Korean series and films, but also to watch foreign series and films. The name of the app is literally translated as Magnolia Flower, and Magnolia is the national flower of the DPRK. And the interface of the app really looks like Netflix. They have different films, series, not only of North Korean origin, but also of foreign origin. For example, I know that at this very moment, several Chinese dramas are very popular, and they are being released in that app with North Korean subtitles. And people are really crazy about them because they really like dramas there. North Korean dramas, Chinese dramas, and other TV series. They also really like Soviet films and Russian films, and you can find them there too. But what is even more shocking is that you can find a lot of Western cartoons in that app. For example, you can find Paddington, you can find Despicable Me, you can find Ice Age, and many more. A lot of people erroneously think that North Korea does not allow anything foreign and anything Western in specific, but that is simply not true, because you can find quite some foreign cartoons, films, and also books.
Now, before anyone says that's just someone on TikTok, consider the fact that almost everything you know about North Korea comes from anonymous sources on US state-funded media, and that hearing from people who lived or even just studied there can be just as valuable. The truth is, North Korea allows foreign media pretty much based on if your country has good diplomatic relations. So countries like China, Russia, India can have their movies and TV shows and books in North Korea, where North Koreans can see different cultures, completely different levels of wealth compared to theirs, and completely different forms of government. The idea that we only need to expose North Koreans to YouTube and Marvel movies and Colleen Hoover books, and that would immediately all wake them up from a collective trance because they never considered that different countries were different, is born out of a racist stereotype that East Asians are not individuals, but all part of a collective, machines that all think and act the same way. As we talked about earlier, North Koreans absolutely know what Squid Game is, and more defectors report that whether the government allows it or not, the majority of North Korean youth does actively engage with media from the South or the West. Now, as for vacations, while it's true that North Koreans are not vacationing in France or in Italy, they do operate in the same sort of way that the countries of the Eastern Bloc operated, with permissions given out to visit countries that they have good diplomatic relations with. There are more than 10,000 North Korean workers and even more students that move in between China, Russia, and the DPRK, not to mention a bunch of other countries in East Asia that work or study engineering, construction, medicine, or cooking. Now, the same news outlets that report the stories of unicorns and public execution of school children like to say that these are all actually slaves, that nobody ever gets paid. But let's take a look at one of these stories, like this BBC article that reports that North Koreans in China are slaves, but inside the article, it states that none of the information was verified. On any topic, completely unverified information would not be allowed to be published, but because it's the DPRK, journalistic integrity is completely dropped. So, although North Koreans do face government restrictions relating to their travel and the media they can consume, not all foreign media from the US is banned, and they've shown to be much more open to countries that have good diplomatic relations with them. And also, it's not really like North Koreans who do live in countries that are unfriendly with their government have really good experiences in those countries at all. In South Korea, they're openly discriminated against, and in Japan, for example, there are thousands of Koreans with DPRK passports who study in Korean schools that face repeated and violent discrimination from the Japanese government and public. In 2010, a law was passed that introduced reduced tuition fees for students in foreign schools in Japan, for all international schools except for Koreans. These schools are repeatedly threatened both by protests of right-wing Japanese people who call Korean people cockroaches, as well as sometimes physically abuse them with knives. The school used to have a policy of wearing traditional Korean clothing, but they had to stop because it made students targets of hate crimes when they were on their way home. And because of these threats and the fact that these schools are more expensive, the vast majority of Koreans in Japan, almost 90%, attend Japanese schools. Actually, in the 60s and 70s, North Koreans were also allowed to travel to Europe as well, Eastern Europe, to the countries that had friendly relations with them. I was actually speaking to my own family that lived most of their life in East Germany, and they told me that they remembered their parents having older North Korean friends who had permanently moved to Germany. How much of these restrictive policies are because North Korea is a highly protective country that's been at war with us for 70 years, I guess we will only find out once the war is over. But instead of being concerned that North Koreans aren't on TikTok so they can be exposed to our brain rot, our European art films, our self-help books, and that you haven't seen any North Koreans on your vacations to Dubai, maybe we should be more concerned about why our government hasn't signed a peace treaty yet, and maybe after that, they would be more willing to open up like they have to other countries that aren't actively at war with them. 9. In the DPRK, everything is fake.
We're traveling like hundreds of kilometers to get to Pyongyang, and we're passing all these cornfields, and like all the tourists there on the train were just like, oh, it's fake corn. Like,
Yeah,
they
it's
put
all
it
plastic.
Oh my
They
God.
put it there for us, so they to convince us they're not starving. We're just like,
Come on.
It's a million times easier to grow corn than to make fake corn.
Yeah,
Like fake corn's
exactly.
so like labor intensive compared to planting.
And we had it other times when we were actually in Pyongyang, and we're on the subway, and people were like accusing to the guide that these people we were seeing were like circling back around to make it look like there were crowds, and this guy was like, "Oh, I've seen that guy before. I've seen that guy before." And I was like, "No, you're just racist."
This is it, the core lie that leads to everything else. The DPRK is condemned without context, any real further analysis by the average person, as a totalitarian country with no human rights, literally a hell on earth. And if that's already the country in your head, then anything you read about it can be justified. We're told the DPRK is a land of hunger, that they ban burgers and ice cream, but you point to the fact that Kim Jong-un's aunt is a manager at a burger restaurant in Pyongyang, and you try to provide the context about food insecurity and the government's policy of self-sufficiency, and we're told that's all just propaganda. We're told that everyone in North Korea is a slave to the government, that there are no human rights, it's a gray place with no feelings, and you point to the fact that the government has invested millions in building new modern apartments for its citizens, into vacation resorts, so that when North Koreans take paid time off, which they are legally entitled to by the way, they have somewhere to stay for free. And in response, we're told that the buildings are all fake, that they're just for show. Stories about executions of government officials that have magically risen from the dead a few weeks later, unicorns, required haircuts. You can talk and explain and provide context until finally you're told, oh well, if you love North Korea so much, why don't you go there? So you go to North Korea, as thousands of Western tourists do. It is one of the easiest visas to get after all, and you spend a week in North Korea and you discover the horrible truth. That Pyongyang is a city, just like every other city in a third world country, and the rural parts are the same as all the other rural parts in every other third world country, filled with people who live their normal lives, students who skip school, security guards who take their jobs too seriously, spouses who cheat on one another, kids on playdates, and that none of them, not one, care even the tiniest amount that you are in their country. And then you come back to Europe or the US and you report your findings that North Korea is a country filled with normal people like every other country in the world. And what's always the answer? It's fake. In the US, we have millionaire sex offenders like James Franco making movies about how everything in North Korea is fake. The food, the people, the emotions, everything. And people believe it. Why? You really believe you're so special? That the entire country would mobilize to put on a show just for you. All of this to say that please, please, don't just fall into reaction the next time you read a crazy story about North Korea. Actually use your brain and think about if anything you are reading makes any sense. And if you can read any story about North Korea, no matter how abnormal and removed from reality it is, something that even your own logic tells you is too crazy to believe, and you can still justify it in your head as being true, then maybe you're the one that's brainwashed. To recap, yes, there is still hunger in North Korea. It is not a rich country, the government is controlling, and there are human rights violations. But when you compare the standards of living of North Koreans to those of other countries with similar incomes, you put the government restrictions in the context of living under martial law for 70 years, and you compare the human rights abuses to those of the US, what you find is not this completely irrational, abnormal, and evil country that is normally portrayed, but one that has tried its hardest to survive by adapting to its material conditions. So now we come back to the original question posed in the beginning of this video. Why are there two Koreas, and why have they not unified? On paper, North Korea, South Korea, and the United States all have a policy to promote reunification, but the reality is obviously quite different. It should be noted that for the first 30 years of a divided Korea, it was the North that was consistently making proposals towards reunification that were being rejected by the South. The original elections that elected the first Supreme People's Assembly all the way back in 1948 were a bid to reunify both Koreas under a government elected by elections in the entire country. And in 1961, the North-South Korean Students for Reunification Congress was also planned to take place under the initiative of students of both sides of Korea, but this attempt at beginning a reunification process was blocked by the coup of Park Chung-hee that made it official South Korean state policy to completely reject any attempt at discussing reunification with the North until the South had developed to a point where it could argue from a place of power. Nevertheless, during Park Chung-hee's rule, Kim Il-sung proposed a confederation of two separate Korean states that would each maintain their independent economic systems, and that after a set period of time, there would be a peninsula-wide election that would elect a new political system, creating a reunified state. In the 1980s, Kim would propose a confederation of two separate states again, where the military of both states would be unified, but the economic and political systems would remain different for a time. In 1988, Roh Tae-woo counter-proposed the exact opposite of this proposal, that the economic and political systems would unify, but that each half would maintain their separate military. This proposal went against one of North Korea's requirements for a reunification since the 40s. The complete withdrawal of the US military from the peninsula, and so this time, Kim Il-sung was the one that rejected the proposal. One of the core parts of the reason why reunification hasn't been possible is the presence of the US military in Korea. Every proposal towards a reunification made towards South Korea includes the removal or the eventual removal of the US military from the South. An attempt to unify without this condition being met would mean that the DPRK would de facto be accepting a military occupation by America on its territory. North Korea officially considers South Korea to be a puppet state, and so we have to talk about the sovereignty of South Korea because you can really see this in two different ways. From one perspective, South Korea exists to protect the class interests of South Korean capitalists, and not only does it do this very well, it also sometimes goes against the will of the US. On the other hand, the question of not having an independent military raises serious questions about how sovereign a country can really be if it loses control over its entire military as soon as the country enters a war. South Korea as a state only truly formed through direct US involvement. Syngman Rhee was a hand-picked leader who created the country, and the dictators who ruled Korea for the following 30 years after him came directly out of a military that the US had control over. And since the IMF loans in the 90s forced South Korea to liberalize parts of their economy, laws have been passed in South Korea that allow US companies operating in the South to appeal laws that they think would harm their business interests, even if those laws are popular with the citizens of South Korea. For example, in 2024, South Korea wanted to introduce some increased regulations on online platforms to curb the virtual monopoly of foreign companies in the country. And because American companies are the ones who would lose profit if this law were to pass, multiple companies have come together to sue the South Korean government. So is South Korea a puppet state? Not in the sense that the United States directly picks the leader of South Korea, at least not anymore. But when you factor in that South Korea has no independent military, does not control all of its territory, can have its laws changed by foreign companies, and that its government was directly set up by the US military against the will of South Koreans, it does raise a lot of questions. Of course, it was also in the late 80s that another country was in the process of reunifying, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say getting annexed. When East Germany fell, South Koreans went to Germany to study the process of unification, to see if something similar could be applied to Korea. Of course, the process of German unification was not the peaceful coming together of two countries, but the complete destruction of the institutions, economy, and businesses of the East, which triggered a massive economic crisis in the east of Germany that led to hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs, homes, and access to education and social services. While South Koreans were originally optimistic that something like this could be applied in Korea, they soon realized that what West Germany did to the GDR would not be a viable option. A South Korean-funded think tank, the Korean Development Institute, published a study in 1991 that estimated that if the South absorbed the North in a way similar to what had happened in Germany, yearly expenses would increase by an estimated $47 billion, which was almost equal to the government's yearly budget. But then, of course, if reunification could not be achieved via the dismantling of the North Korean government, followed by a rapid absorption, then the other way to reunify would be a more planned, gradual approach of increased cooperation. Except much of South Korea's ruling class does not want this to happen either. In 1994, an article published in Business Korea by Son Ji-ae, a journalist who has worked for CNN, the World Bank, and currently works in the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, warned against a slow integration with the North, stating, "If South and North Korea move closer to genuine reconciliation, or even reunification, the social atmosphere will be loosened with less rigid government controls and social norms, which could contribute to more active labor movements in the South. The infiltration of socialist principles into the country's labor unions may increase, leading to a toughened stance toward management and authorities." Even 50 years later, the South Korean government is terrified of introducing any North Korean ideas into society for fear of a stronger labor movement. There have been attempts to continue talks on reunification, but no progress has been made because the countries have been locked into a stalemate. North Korea wants a gradual integration of both countries that will lead to a new independent Korean state and the removal of all foreign military from the country. The US refuses to leave, and South Korea fears the social effects on the labor movement that would result from allowing North Korean ideas to enter South Korean society. The recent South Korean president has proposed the idea of absorbing the DPRK into the Republic of Korea with a continued US presence, a proposal that the DPRK obviously ignored, and it seems that in the last 2 years, for the first time in more than 75 years, North Korea has shifted its policy from being about reunification to being more about internal unity, and has officially designated South Korea as a hostile state, a designation that South Korea has considered the North for years, signaling that neither country is willing to budge, leading to a near-complete abandonment of talks. But what do the people think about reunification? According to polls taken by the Korea Institute for National Unification, well into the 1990s, more than 80% of Koreans believed reunification to be essential. But in 2010, that number has dropped to 50%. Today, a majority of young Koreans don't believe reunification is essential, even though the overall population still remains about 50-50 on the issue. In fact, some polls seem to indicate that most South Koreans don't think about North Korea at all. And while it's difficult to find polling on North Korean public opinion, during the making of this video, I have watched I don't even know how many interviews, documentaries, and movies, and almost every time a North Korean refers to a South Korean, it is almost always as brothers and sisters. Although I have to imagine that the policy of moving away from reunification to redesignation of a hostile state has affected this somewhat. If nothing changes, as unfortunately seems to be the case, the issue of reunification, which was a top priority for Koreans up until the 90s, could be moving further and further away, and the conflict could become even uglier than it already is. As time passes, less and less people alive today remember it ever being another way, and the millions of families who have been separated because of this conflict are beginning to die out, without ever being able to find their families again. All the way back when I was still in school and I heard that there was even a Korean War that had happened at all, I wanted to learn about it, and one of the first videos I ever saw of Koreans were these. Clips from a KBS broadcast called Finding Dispersed Families, a program that ran in the 80s. I didn't really understand what I was watching at the age of maybe 14, but I watched probably over an hour of these clips of Korean families that had been separated during the war, finding each other decades later. Although I've made my personal opinions pretty clear throughout the video, I also like to think that I've tried to contextualize a lot of the decisions made by the North and South Korean government and the North and South Korean people so as to make you think about why things developed in the way they did. When it comes to the division of this country, the murder of literally millions of civilians in a war that did not need to be as bloody as it was, the separation of many more millions of families, and all the barriers that have sprung up in the attempts at reunification, the West, but specifically the United States, holds such a massive responsibility for the current situation that I would actually argue it's more responsible than both North and South Korea are. Which of course brings up the difficult questions like, what should people in these countries responsible for the situation in the global South who want to be anti-imperialists do? What opinions are worth having and expressing? Is it anti-imperialist, for example, when Western leftists condemn the DPRK for not being communist enough or for investing money into its military while people are hungry, without including the fact that the DPRK has been threatened with its total destruction by not only its much more powerful neighbor, but by the most powerful country in the world? Is it solidarity when the Western left describes the DPRK in the same way that the American and European media does, without analyzing why the people are poor, why the government has hardened into what it is today, basing even the real criticism to be made of the DPRK on exaggerations and fantasies by the US State Department, without acknowledging that despite the sanctions and the constant threat of war, citizens in the DPRK still have a higher quality of life than much of the capitalist third world? Are we doing the best for Koreans when every time a North Korean athlete participates in the Olympics or a video of North Koreans living their everyday life is posted online and the comments are filled with people describing them as emotionless robots, aliens from another species, or fantasizing about ways they will be tortured or killed? I think any perspective or opinion on North or South Korea, for that matter, that does not put American involvement at the forefront is not solidarity, but rather accepting the framing of the situation presented by the media. There is nothing better that we in the West can do for any Koreans than to 1. Bring an end to the Korean War, 2. Force our governments to end the decades of economic sanctions that prevent North Korea from being able to export its products and participate in the global system, forcing it to rely on humanitarian aid, and 3. To force an end to the occupation of the American military in South Korea that started after the Second World War. The first step towards actually doing something is being interested in actually learning about it, not just reading some American senator's murder fantasies. And I hope that this video has been a very small step into trying to broaden the perspective on Korea. I have included, along with the sources used in this video, a more condensed recommended reading and viewing list in the description for people who want to dive deeper into any specific parts of the video. But along with that, if you really want to show solidarity with people in the global periphery, then the best way to do that is to actually speak to and read what people in the global periphery have to say. There are numerous organizations, some of which operate in the US and Europe, that actually do have programs and write about reunification and better understanding of the North. Among these organizations is SPARC, the Solidarity for Peace and Reunification of Korea, whose goal is to reunify Korea and the disarmament of the entire peninsula through dialogue, the Korea Peace Appeal, whose goal is to bring an end to the Korean War, and No Dutol, an organization of Koreans in the diaspora who are organizing for the complete withdrawal of American military forces from Korea. Another good resource I'd suggest is the YouTube channel DPRK Explained, a channel run by, I think, a British tour guide of North Korea, but I'm not 100% sure of that, that publishes a lot of videos on specific parts of life in the DPRK, how the government and economy works, and history of the country that is not widely available. He goes in a lot more depth than I do. I really recommend this channel. In this video, we have briefly gone over much of modern Korean history. A history that is marked with violence, foreign interference, forced political divisions, a lot of beauty and resistance, and a lot of death. We've talked about the colonial history of Japan, the beginnings of the Cold War, the brutality of the Korean War and its origins, the bombings, the executions, the genocide on Jeju Island, the economic planning that led South Korea to develop as rapidly as it did, the way that the IMF took advantage of its one-time ally to plunder the economy, the Sino-Soviet split and its effect on North Korea, the sanctions that destroyed the North Korean economy, the Kim family, Juche, and ultimately the reunification of a country that was artificially separated against the explicit will of the people.
And the North Koreans have suffered because the United States has done everything we possibly could to destroy the economy of North Korea. We've done everything we possibly could to boost the economy of South Korea. and then we condemn them because they are backward and because their people are starving.
I struggled with how exactly I could end a video like this, but I think I've come to a decision. The Song of Arirang is one of the first texts I read in the making of this video, and it recounts the lives of many Koreans fighting against the Japanese in China. Among those revolutionaries mentioned, Kim Sam gives many interviews to the author Helen Foster Snow. Kim himself would die shortly after the interviews he gave, at the age of 33, tragically at the hands of the Communist Party of China, who had believed that he had been spying for the Japanese. It wasn't for several more decades that an investigation would be launched and discover that Kim Sam had not been a traitor, but a genuine revolutionary. In his conversation with Snow, Kim says, "Nearly all the friends and comrades of my youth are dead. Hundreds of them. Nationalist, Christian, anarchist, terrorist, communist. But they are alive to me. Where their graves should be, no one ever cared. On the battlefields and execution grounds, on the streets of city and village, their warm revolutionary blood flowed proudly into the soil of Korea, Manchuria, Siberia, Japan, and China. They failed in the immediate thing, but history keeps a fine accounting. A man's name and his brief dream may be buried with his bones, but nothing that he has ever done or failed to do is lost in the final balance of forces. This is his immortality, his glory or his shame. Not even he himself can change this objective fact, for he is history. Nothing can rob a man of his place in the movement of history. Nothing can grant him escape. His only individual decision is whether to move forward or backward, whether to fight or submit, whether to create value or destroy it, whether to be strong or weak." And if you watched all of that and you still feel the need to comment something like, "Oh yeah, well if you love North Korea so much, then why don't you go there?" Then I'm excited to announce that you can join all my lovely supporters on Patreon and donate money to my work in the hope that I can go to North Korea myself one day. I would genuinely love to go to North Korea, and you can be a part of that financing. A massive thanks to all my supporters on Patreon, which you can see on screen right now. Again, I'd like to thank Cal, Dirk K, Finn Hammock, CMP6408, Dooley, Almudena Carrasco Pasos, Gabia Nontesi, Dangerman 1973, Born Again Janice, I Snort SSRI Sometimes, and Yatgo 11. Sorry this video took so long. It was supposed to be way shorter, but then as I kept reading, I kept having to grow the script, and now it's this giant video you've just watched. The next video will be shorter, but I will hopefully have another massive video like this one coming out in, I hope, July. So subscribe if you want to see that. Like the video, share it with your comrades, get yourself organized, read or watch one of the sources I've put in the description of this video, and thank you for watching.